Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a silence that stretches across 60 million years. It is the silence of worlds turned to dust beneath the slow grinding of cosmic time. It is the silence of tombs sealed so deep beneath planetary crusts that the civilizations above them rise, flourish, and crumble to nothing without ever knowing they danced upon the graves of gods. It is the silence of a species that traded everything it was for everything it thought it wanted, and then had to live forever with the consequences. The Necrons. Say the name slowly. Let it settle in your mind the way it settles in the minds of those unfortunate enough to witness their awakening. These are not the shambling dead of some forgotten horror story. These are not mindless automatons hammered together in some dark forge. The Necrons are something far more unsettling, far more tragic, and far more dangerous than any simple monster could ever be. They are the remnants of a civilization so ancient that the stars they were born under have long since burned out and gone cold. They are warriors sealed inside bodies of living metal, their consciousness preserved across epochs that would reduce mountains to sand and oceans to vapor. They are, by almost any reasonable measure, the most technologically advanced species in the entire galaxy. And they are afraid. That is what we are here to talk about tonight. Not the Necrons as conquerors, not the Necrons as some unstoppable tide of metallic death sweeping across the stars, though they are certainly that. Tonight, we are going to pull back the necrodermis plating and look at what lurks beneath. And we are going to explore the fears that haunt a species that has already lost almost everything there is to lose. We are going to trace the quiet terrors that drive the silent king from his self-imposed exile, that make ancient overlords wake screaming from stasis with no voice to scream, that cause entire dynasties to turn upon one another in desperate attempts to outrun a doom they can feel closing in but cannot name. Because the truth is, the Necrons are not fearless. They never were. Even when they were the Necron, when they were flesh and blood and pain and cancer and short, agonizing lives lived beneath a star that hated them, fear was woven into every fiber of their civilization. Fear of death, fear of insignificance, fear that they would be forgotten, that their brief flicker of existence would be snuffed out, and the universe would go on turning as though they had never been. It was fear that drove them to the stars in the first place, fear that pushed them into the arms of the Satan, fear that made them agree to a bargain so terrible that its consequences would ripple across 60 million years of history and touch every living thing in the galaxy. And now, sealed inside bodies that will never age, never tire, never truly die, the Necrons have discovered something that the Necron never could have imagined. Immortality does not cure fear, it perfects it. When you can never die, you have forever to be afraid. So settle in, get comfortable, let the ambient hum of the tomb world fill the spaces between these words, and let us walk together through the fears of the deathless ones. Let us understand what keeps the lords of the infinite empire awake during those long cold watches between the stars. Before we can understand what the Necrons fear now, we need to understand what made them who they are. We need to go back, far back, past the Great Sleep, past the shattering of the Catan, past the war in heaven, all the way back to the beginning. Back to a species called the Necron, and a world that was trying its very best to kill them. The Necron homeworld orbited a star in the region of space known as the Halo Stars, and that star was nothing short of malevolent. It bathed the planet in punishing waves of radiation, bombarding every living thing with enough ionizing energy to corrode flesh and corrupt genetic material on a fundamental level. The Necron were born into a universe that seemed designed to destroy them from the inside out. Cancers riddled their bodies. Diseases consumed them before they could reach anything resembling old age. Their lives were short, painful, and defined almost entirely by the certainty that death was coming soon, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. This shaped them in ways that are difficult to overstate. The Necrontyre became a civilization obsessed with death. Not in the morbid, gothic fashion of some death cult, but in the way a drowning man is obsessed with air. Death was the central fact of their existence, the axis around which everything else rotated. Their cities were built as much for the dead as for the living. Vast sepulchres and tomb complexes stretching across the landscape, and monuments to the fallen that dwarfed the dwellings of those still drawing breath. The Necrontyre honored their dead because the dead outnumbered the living by such a staggering margin that to do otherwise would have been to deny the fundamental nature of their reality. But alongside this obsession with death came something else, a burning, white-hot resentment of those who did not have to die. The Necrontyre looked out into the galaxy and saw the Old Ones, that ancient race of beings who seemed to have cracked the code of immortality, who lived for eons, while the Necrontyre shriveled and rotted and were reduced to dust within decades. The Necrontyre begged the Old Ones for help. They pleaded for the secret of eternal life, for some scrap of knowledge that might extend their wretched existence beyond the meager handful of years their poisonous star allowed them. The Old Ones refused. The reasons for that refusal are lost to the deep time of galactic history. Perhaps the Old Ones feared what the Necrontyre would become with immortality. Perhaps they simply did not care about the suffering of a species they considered beneath their notice. Whatever the reason, the refusal lit a fire in the Necrontyre that would never be extinguished. It transformed their fear of death into rage, and their rage into war. The war in heaven, as it came to be known, was the conflict that would reshape the entire galaxy. And it began because one species was afraid of dying, and another species would not help them. The Necrontyre lost that first war, badly, while the Old Ones were immeasurably more powerful, more advanced, more connected to the fundamental forces of reality than the Necrontyre could ever hope to be. The Necrontyre were pushed back to their homeworld, humiliated and broken, forced to endure the radiation and the cancers and the short, miserable lives they had been trying so desperately to escape. It should have been the end of their story, a failed species, a footnote in galactic history, forgotten and irrelevant. But then came the Satan. The Satan, the star gods, were entities of such staggering power and alien nature that the word God barely does them justice. They were beings of pure energy, who fed upon the electromagnetic radiation of stars, ancient beyond any meaningful comprehension, predating the formation of planets and the evolution of organic life by eons. When the Necrontyre discovered them, or were discovered by them, or were manipulated into discovering them depending on which account you believe, everything changed. It was a Satan, known as Mephetron, the Deceiver, who first approached the Silent King Sarek with the offer that would transform the Necrontyre forever. The Deceiver spun a tale of ancient wars and shared enemies, of power and vengeance, and the immortality that the Necrontyre craved above all else. He promised that the Satan could deliver everything the Old Ones had denied them: eternal life, unbreakable bodies, the strength to crush their enemies and rule the galaxy as they had always deserved. And the price, the Deceiver assured them, would be negligible, a small sacrifice in exchange for everything. The Silent King debated the offer for a year. The court astrologer, Orican the Diviner, was the lone voice warning against it, but his concerns were drowned out by the desperate hope of a species that had been dying since the moment it was born. In the end, Sarek agreed, and the biotransference began. What happened in those biofurnaces is one of the most horrifying events in the entire history of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and that is saying something given the competition. Every single Necrontyre, from the highest noble to the lowest labourer, was marched into colossal machines and subjected to a process that stripped away their flesh, their organs, their blood, their warmth, and replaced it all with living metal called necrodermis. They emerged as the Necrons, immortal and virtually indestructible, their bodies gleaming with the same substance that gave form to the Satan themselves. But the price was far greater than anything the Deceiver had suggested. Because the Satan did not just take the Necrontyrs' flesh, they took their souls. Every scrap of life energy, every spark of spiritual essence, every fragment of what made the Necrontyr more than just animated matter was devoured by the star gods as the biotransference process churned on. The Satan fed upon an entire species worth of souls like a man gorging himself at a feast, growing stronger with every consciousness that was ripped from its body and consumed. What emerged from the other side of the biofurnaces was not the Necrontyr transformed. It was the Necrontyr destroyed and something new left in their place. The vast majority of those who went through the process lost everything that made them who they were: their memories, their personalities, their hopes. As their fears, their loves, their hatreds, all of it was stripped away along with their flesh, leaving behind nothing but hollow shells that could follow orders but could no longer think or feel or dream. Only the highest-ranking members of Necrontyr society, the nobles and the warriors of sufficient status, were given the complex circuitry necessary to retain some semblance of their former selves. And even they were diminished, ghostly echoes of the people they had been, their emotions muted, their memories fragmentary, their connection to their own identity fraying at the edges. When Zarek emerged from his own biotransference and looked upon what had become of his people, he understood the magnitude of his mistake. He had sought to save his species, and instead he had destroyed it. But the Satan had kept their promise in the most terrible way possible. The Necrons were immortal, yes, they would never die, but they would also never truly live again. This is the foundational fear of the Necrons, the original sin from which all their other terrors flow. They are afraid because they know, in whatever passes for the deepest recesses of their mechanical consciousness, that they made a mistake so catastrophic that 60 million years of existence has not been enough to undo it. They traded their souls for immortality and received both, and the combination has proven to be a curse beyond anything the cruelest torturer could devise. This is where everything begins. The Necrons are afraid of what they have already become, and everything else, every other fear, we will discuss tonight. Is a branch growing from the roots of that fundamental, inescapable horror. Now, to understand the full scope of what haunts the Necrons, we need to look at the one threat that was so terrifying, so existentially devastating, that it drove the most powerful being in the entire Necron Empire to break a self-imposed exile that had lasted for millions of years. We need to talk about the Tyranids. The Silent King, Zarek, is a figure of almost incomprehensible age and grief. After the war in heaven was won, after the Satan were shattered and imprisoned, after the old ones were driven to extinction and the galaxy was left in ruins, Zarek looked upon what remained of his people and made a decision. He ordered the Necrons to sleep. The entire species, every warrior, every lord, every cryptek and destroyer and lich guard, there was to enter stasis in the tomb worlds they had constructed across the galaxy. They would sleep for 60 million years, and when they awoke, the galaxy would have healed. New civilizations would have risen. New opportunities for conquest would present themselves. And perhaps, in that distant future, the Necrons would find a way to undo the horror of biotransference and return to their original, organic forms. But Zarek himself did not sleep. He severed the command protocols that bound his subjects to his will, an act of penance for the doom he had brought upon them. And then he left. He went into the void between galaxies, the vast and empty darkness that separates the Milky Way from its neighbors. And there he wandered, alone. For millions upon millions of years, the Silent King drifted through the intergalactic void, carrying the weight of his guilt across distances so immense that they beggar the imagination. And then, somewhere in that endless darkness, he found the Tyranids. The exact circumstances of this encounter are shrouded in mystery. How the Silent King happened to stumble upon an extragalactic threat in the vastness of the void between galaxies is a question that some Necron lords have found troubling enough to investigate, though those who press too hard for answers have a tendency to be taken by the Triarch Praetorians and never seen again. But the details of the encounter matter less than its consequences. Because when Zarek saw the Tyranids, when he comprehended what they were and what they intended, he was afraid. Truly, deeply. Fundamentally afraid in a way that he had not been since the moment he realized what the Satan had done to his people. The Tyranids are not like other threats the Necrons have faced. They are not a rival civilization to be outmaneuvered or an enemy army to be destroyed on the battlefield. The Tyranids are a force of nature, an extragalactic swarm of organic life so vast and so ravenous that it makes the greatest military forces in the galaxy look like children playing at war. They consume everything, every shred of biomass, every drop of water, every molecule of organic matter on every world they touch is absorbed into the hive fleet and used to fuel the production of more Tyranids, which then move on to the next world and the next, an ever-growing tide of consumption that leaves nothing but bare rock in its wake. Now, yet you might think that the Necrons, being mechanical beings with no biomass to consume, would have nothing to fear from the Tyranids, and in a purely direct, military sense, that is partially true. The Tyranids gain nothing from consuming Necrons. There is no biomass to harvest, no organic matter to break down and repurpose. From the Tyranids' perspective, a Necron tomb world is a barren rock, unworthy of the effort required to devour it. But the Silent King understood something that a more short-sighted leader might have missed. The Tyranids were not a threat to the Necrons' bodies. They were a threat to the Necrons' future. Remember the great dream that sustains so many of the surviving Necron dynasties. The hope that one day, somehow, the process of biotransference can be reversed, yet that the Necrons can shed their mechanical forms and return to organic bodies, to flesh and blood and beating hearts, and all the messy, beautiful, painful reality of being alive. This is not a universal ambition among the Necrons. Some have accepted their mechanical existence, and others have gone mad in ways that make the question irrelevant. But for the Silent King, and for a significant portion of the Necron leadership, the reversal of biotransference is the ultimate goal. It is the light at the end of a tunnel that stretches across millions of years of darkness. It is the reason they preserved the galaxy's organic life in the first place, rather than simply exterminating everything that breathed. And the Tyranids threaten to snuff that light out forever. If the Tyranids consume all the biomass in the galaxy, and if they strip every world of every living thing and leave behind nothing but silent, sterile rock, then there will be no organic bodies for the Necrons to transfer into. There will be no species to study, no biological templates to work from, no raw materials from which to reconstruct the flesh that was stolen from them 60 million years ago. The dream of reversal will die, and the Necrons will be trapped in their metal shells for the rest of eternity, which for a species that is functionally immortal is a very long time indeed. This is what drove the Silent King to end his exile. This is what made him break his self-imposed sentence of wandering the void and return to the galaxy he had left behind so many millions of years before. Not out of any desire to rule, though that ambition still burns within him. Not out of any love for the organic species that now infest the worlds his people once claimed, though he recognizes their value as potential future vessels for Necron consciousness. Zarek came back because he saw a future in which the Necrons would be alone in a dead galaxy, immortal and unchangeable, and trapped forever in a state of existence that was never meant to be permanent, and that future terrified him more than anything he had encountered in all his millions of years of wandering. Since his return, the Silent King has made the destruction of the Tyranids his primary objective. He has traveled from tomb world to tomb world, awakening sleeping dynasties and marshalling their forces against the hive fleets. He has even, in a move that shocked the entire galactic community, formed temporary alliances with other species to combat the Tyranid threat. The most famous of these was the Gehenna campaign, where Necron forces under the Silent King's command fought alongside the Blood Angels' Space Marine chapter to repel a Tyranid invasion. The commander of the Blood Angels, Dante, actually met with the Silent King in person, and during their conversation, Zarek claimed to have previously spoken with the Blood Angel's Primarch, Sanguinius, implying that his return to the galaxy may have occurred far earlier than most accounts suggest. The willingness of the Silent King to work alongside humanity, even temporarily, speaks volumes about the depth of his fear regarding the Tyranids. The Necrons do not form alliances lightly. They do not cooperate with lesser species out of kindness or shared purpose. But for Sarek to set aside tens of millions of years of isolationist policy and extend his hand to a species his people would normally consider beneath contempt suggests that the threat he sees in the Tyranids is not merely significant. It is existential. It is the kind of threat that overrides every other consideration, that makes ancient grudges and racial superiority complexes seem petty and irrelevant in the face of potential annihilation. And the truly frightening thing, the detail that keeps the Silent King staring into the void during those long watches between the stars, is that the Tyranids he has encountered so far may only be the vanguard. The hive fleets that have reached the galaxy, enormous as they are, may represent only a tiny fraction of the total Tyranid biomass lurking in the intergalactic void. Its Imperial scholars and xenobiologists have theorized that the main body of the Tyranid swarm is still out there, somewhere in the darkness between galaxies, a mass of organic life so inconceivably vast that the hive fleets the galaxy has faced so far are merely its exploratory tendrils. If that is true, then the threat the Tyranids pose to the Necrons' dream of organic restoration is not just significant, it is potentially insurmountable. The Silent King knows this. He has seen things in the void that he does not speak of, even to his closest advisors. He carries knowledge that would shake the confidence of even the most arrogant Necron overlord. And he is afraid, not for himself, for a being who has lived for tens of millions of years has long since made peace with his own existence, but for his people. For the species he doomed to an eternity of metal and circuitry, and the ghostly echo of emotions they can no longer truly feel. He is afraid that the Tyranids will steal from the Necrons the one thing they have left: hope. This is perhaps the cruelest irony in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. The Necrons, who threw away their organic bodies in exchange for mechanical immortality, now desperately need organic life to survive in any meaningful sense. And the greatest threat to that organic life comes not from within the galaxy, but from the same intergalactic void where the Silent King spent millions of years in lonely penance. The darkness he fled into for atonement delivered unto him the very doom he fears most. And now he races against time, a concept that should be meaningless to an immortal being, but somehow isn't. Trying to unite a fractured and often hostile empire against a threat that many of his subjects do not yet fully comprehend. The Tyranids do not negotiate. They do not bargain. They do not slow down or reconsider or show mercy. They simply consume. And every world they strip bare is another world that will never host the organic life the Necrons need to reclaim what was taken from them. Every hive fleet that reaches the galaxy is another step toward a future the Silent King cannot accept. Every tendril of the great devourer that wraps itself around a populated world and squeezes the life from it is another nail in the coffin of the Necrons' impossible dream. And so, the Silent King fights. He schemes and he manipulates and he forges alliances with species he despises, all because he is afraid. Afraid of the hunger that comes from beyond the stars. Afraid of a future where the Necrons endure forever in a galaxy with nothing left to save them from themselves. To truly grasp the depth of what the Necrons carry with them, we need to spend more time with who they were before the metal consumed them. We need to feel the weight of the radiation. We need to understand what it was like to build a civilization in the shadow of a star that hated you. Picture a world where the sky is not blue, but a sickly, perpetual amber, stained by the radiation that bleeds from the star above like an open wound. The ground is scorched and cracked, baked by energies that would kill a human in hours and that killed the Necrontire slowly, lovingly, over the course of lifetimes so short they barely qualified as such. A child born on the Necrontyre homeworld could expect, if they were fortunate, to live perhaps 40 years. Many did not make it past 30. Some were claimed by the cancers before they reached adulthood, their bodies riddled with tumors that grew faster than their physicians could treat them, consumed from within by cells that had been twisted by radiation into something hungry and relentless and utterly indifferent to the suffering they caused. This was not an accident of geography or a quirk of stellar physics. This was the fundamental condition of Necrontyre existence. Every generation watched its parents die young. Every parent knew that their children would follow. The tombs that dominated the Necrontyre landscape were not morbid affectations but practical necessities. There were more dead than living on any given day. And the architecture of Necrontyre civilization reflected this with a stark honesty that would have been unbearable if the Necrontyre had not been born into it and known nothing else. But they were not resigned to it. That is the crucial detail, the piece of the puzzle that makes everything that follows comprehensible. The Necrontyre were not a passive species, content to accept their fate and make the best of their brief, painful existence. They were furious. They were ambitious. They were driven by a rage against the unfairness of the universe that made them one of the most technologically innovative species in galactic history. They built starships not because they were curious about the cosmos, but because they were desperate to escape the star that was killing them. They colonized worlds not for the joy of exploration, but because every new colony was another chance to find a sun that did not murder its children. They developed medicine and science and engineering, not for the love of knowledge, but because every breakthrough, every incremental improvement was another weapon in their war against death. And when they found the old ones, when they learned that there existed beings who had solved the problem of mortality, who lived for aeons while the Necrontyre rotted and crumbled after mere decades, the rage that had been building for the entire history of their civilization finally boiled over. The Necrontyre did not just want immortality, they felt they were owed it. They looked at the Old One's refusal to share their secrets and saw not a reasonable boundary between species, but a deliberate, malicious withholding of the one thing that could save them. In the minds of the Necrontyre, the Old Ones were not just indifferent, they were complicit. They were allowing the Necrontyre to suffer and die when they had the power to prevent it, and that made them enemies of a species that had been fighting for survival since the day it was born. This is the emotional foundation upon which the entire Necron story is built, not cold, calculating ambition, not the dispassionate pursuit of power, but hot, desperate, screaming rage against a universe that seemed specifically designed to cause them pain. The Necrontyre were not villains. They were victims who became villains. And the distinction matters because it means that everything the Necrons fear today is rooted in a pain that was real and legitimate and terrible. When the Satan came offering immortality, the Necrontyre did not accept out of greed. They accepted out of desperation. They were a drowning species, grasping at a lifeline, and they did not have the luxury of examining the rope too closely before they grabbed it. The Silent King debated the offer for a full year, and the fact that he debated at all, given the extremity of his people's suffering, speaks to a caution that history has not given him enough credit for. Orican the Diviner warned against it. Others must have had their doubts. But in the end, the weight of 60 generations of suffering and death and unfulfilled rage was too much. The Necrontyre said yes, and the biofurnaces began to burn, and the screaming started. And when it was over, the Necrontyre were gone, and the Necrons stood in their place, gleaming and immortal and empty. At the fear of the Necrons is the fear of the Necrontyre, transformed but not eliminated. The Necrontyre feared death, and so the Necrons fear the loss of the organic future that could restore them to a state where death is possible. The Necrontyre feared insignificance, and so the Necrons fear the decline of their civilization into irrelevance. The Necrontyre feared being forgotten, and so the Necrons cling to their memories with a desperation that borders on mania, terrified that the last connection to who they once were will dissolve into the static of a degrading consciousness. Everything loops back. Everything connects. The fears of the Necrons are the fears of the Necron-tire, refracted through 60 million years of mechanical existence and amplified by the bitter knowledge that the cure they sought was worse than the disease. But understanding the Necron-tire is only the beginning, because the fears they carried into the biofurnaces did not die with their flesh. Those fears were transformed, just as the Necron-tire were transformed, emerging on the other side of biotransference in new shapes that were, if anything, even more terrible than the originals. And of all the fears that followed the Necrons out of those burning forges and into the cold silence of their new existence, none is more immediate, more visceral, or more desperately urgent than the threat posed by a species that did not even exist when the Necrons first closed their eyes. Let us return to the Tyranids and examine this threat with the detail it deserves, because the more closely you look at the relationship between the Necrons and the Great Devourer, it's the more complex and the more terrifying it becomes. The Tyranids are not merely an army, they are a biological process. They are consumption given form, hunger made manifest on a scale that challenges the capacity of the mind to comprehend. Each hive fleet is a self-contained ecosystem of carnivorous organisms, from the smallest ripper swarm to the largest biotitan, all linked together by a psychic network called the hive mind, that coordinates their actions with a precision that makes the most disciplined military in the galaxy look sloppy by comparison. They strip worlds bare of everything that can be converted into biomass. Water, organic matter, even the atmosphere itself is consumed and processed and fed into the endless cycle of Tyranid reproduction. When a hive fleet leaves a world, it leaves behind nothing, not soil, not water, not air, just rock, bare and sterile and dead, orbiting its star like a skull stripped of its flesh. For the Necrons, the problem with the Tyranids is not tactical. The Necrons can fight the Tyranids. They have fought them on numerous occasions, and they have won. Necron Gauss weaponry is devastating against organic targets, stripping flesh and bone away at the atomic level. The reanimation protocols that allow fallen Necron warriors to rebuild themselves on the battlefield are particularly effective against the Tyranids, because the Tyranids cannot consume Necron bodies for biomass. A battle between Necrons and Tyranids is, from the Tyranid perspective, a net loss. They expend resources fighting an enemy that gives nothing back when defeated. From a purely mathematical standpoint, the Tyranids should avoid Necron tomb worlds, and in many cases, they do. Hive fleets have been observed altering their course to bypass worlds that are known to be Necron-held, presumably because the hive mind has calculated that the energy expenditure required to defeat the defenders would exceed the biomass gained from the planet. But the Tyranids do not always avoid the Necrons. Sometimes, the tomb worlds lie in the path of a hive fleet that cannot or will not deviate. Sometimes the Tyranids attack Necron-held worlds specifically because those worlds are home to organic populations that the Necrons have been cultivating or protecting as potential future vessels for biotransference reversal. And sometimes the hive mind, that vast and unknowable intelligence that directs the actions of trillions of organisms across thousands of light years, all seems to target Necron tomb worlds with deliberate intent, as though it has recognized the Necrons as a threat that must be dealt with regardless of the cost. The Gehenna campaign is the most well-documented example of Necron and Tyranid forces clashing, and it is worth examining in detail because it reveals the lengths to which the Silent King is willing to go when the Tyranid threat becomes immediate. When a Tyranid hive fleet appeared in the Gehenna system, the Silent King found himself in the unusual position of needing allies. The Blood Angels Space Marine chapter was already engaged in a conflict with the Necrons in the system, and the arrival of the Tyranids presented both sides with a common enemy that neither could afford to ignore. What happened next was unprecedented. Yet the Silent King reached out to Commander Dante of the Blood Angels and proposed a temporary alliance against the Tyranids. This was, by any measure, an extraordinary act. The Necrons do not form alliances with organic species. They do not consider organic species to be worthy of alliance. The very concept of treating a race of meat beings as equals, even temporarily, is fundamentally offensive to Necron sensibilities. And yet the Silent King swallowed his pride and made the offer, because the alternative was allowing the Tyranids to consume the biomass of the Gehenna system, and that was a price he was not willing to pay. The alliance was fragile and temporary, as such things always are. But during the brief period of cooperation, Dante and the Silent King actually met face to face. And the conversation they had is one of the most fascinating diplomatic exchanges in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. Zarek, speaking in the manner that has earned him his title, the Silent King who rarely speaks, and when he does speak softly, explained to Dante the nature of the Tyranid threat as he understood it. He did not plead. He did not beg. He simply laid out the facts with the cold precision of a being who has been planning for this contingency for millions of years. The Tyranids, the Silent King explained, were not just a threat to the Imperium or to any individual species. They were a threat to the concept of biological life itself. If they were not stopped, if they were allowed to consume everything, then every organic species in the galaxy would be destroyed. And the galaxy would be left as a sterile wasteland of bare rock and empty space. And for the Necrons, that prospect was not just a strategic concern. It was a personal catastrophe, because the Necrons needed organic life. They needed it to have any hope of reversing the biotransference and returning to the flesh and blood existence that had been stolen from them 60 million years ago. This admission, this acknowledgement of need and vulnerability from a being who had ruled an empire that spanned the galaxy, must have been extraordinarily difficult for Zarek. The Silent King is a creature of immense pride and even greater grief. To admit to a human, a member of a species that the Necrons regard as barely above vermin on the galactic hierarchy, that the Necrons needed something that only organic life could provide, what was an act of vulnerability that goes against every instinct of Necron culture, and yet he did it, because the threat of the Tyranids is great enough to make even a king's pride seem like a small thing. During their conversation, Zarek made an even more extraordinary claim. He told Dante that he had previously had a similar conversation with the Blood Angel's Primarch, Sanguinius, one of the demigod sons of the Emperor of Mankind, who had lived and died 10,000 years before. If true, this implies that the Silent King returned to the galaxy far earlier than most accounts suggest, and that he has been working to build alliances against the Tyranids for millennia.
Honestly, this is the part of the Necron lore that gets me every single time. Because when you really sit with it, when you stop thinking about them as just a scary robot faction and actually listen to what their story is telling you, the Necrons might be the most tragic thing in all of 40k. And I know people say that about a lot of factions, but I genuinely mean it here. These were people, sick, dying, desperate people who got offered a way out by something that did not have their best interests at heart. And they took the deal because what else were they going to do? Watch another generation rot from the inside out? And now they're stuck forever in bodies that do not let them feel the things that make being alive worth the trouble. That is not a villain origin story to me. There is a horror story where the monster and the victim are the same person. And I think that is why I keep coming back to the Necrons. There is something uncomfortably human about a species that gave up its humanity. But anyways, that's just my take. Let's get back to the video.
Some scholars believe the claim is genuine. Others suspect it is a fabrication designed to lend weight to Zarek's diplomatic overtures. And some point out that the Necrons' mastery of temporal manipulation means that the Silent King could potentially have sent a message through time, making the question of when the conversation occurred far more complicated than it first appears. What is not in question is the depth of the Silent King's concern about the Tyranids. He did not break his exile on a whim. He did not return to the galaxy because he was bored or because he had finished his penance. He returned because he encountered something in the intergalactic void that frightened him so completely that 60 million years of self-imposed solitude seemed like a trivial price to pay in exchange for the chance to do something about it. And what he found was not just a hive fleet. It was the shadow of something larger. Something so vast and so terrible that the hive fleets the galaxy has fought so far are merely the advanced scouts of a predator whose true size defies comprehension. The implications of this are staggering. If the Tyranid presence in the galaxy is truly just the leading edge of a much larger swarm, then the threat they pose to the Necrons' future is not merely significant, it is potentially absolute. The Necrons cannot fight an enemy of infinite size with a finite army. They cannot protect every world, every population, every scrap of biomass that might one day be needed for the reversal of biotransference. They can win battles, yes. They can destroy hive fleets, reclaim worlds, build defensive networks of pylons and garrisons that make individual systems impervious to Tyranid assault. But they cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy whose resources are, for all practical purposes, limitless. And so the Silent King's strategy is not purely military. It is also political. He seeks to unite not only the Necron dynasties, but also the other species of the galaxy against the Tyranid threat, reasoning that even the combined might of the Necrons may not be sufficient to stop the Great Devourer on its own. This is a remarkable departure from traditional Necron policy, which has generally regarded other species as either irrelevant or deserving of subjugation. For the Silent King to consider genuine cooperation with organic species, even as a temporary measure, speaks to the magnitude of the fear that drives him. But this strategy comes with its own risks and its own fears. Its alliances with organic species are inherently unstable because the ultimate goals of the Necrons and those of their potential allies are fundamentally incompatible. The Imperium wants to destroy the Necrons. The Eldari want to see the Necrons return to their tombs and never wake up. Even the Orcs would happily fight the Necrons if given the choice between fighting them and fighting the Tyranids. Any alliance the Silent King builds will be a house of cards, maintained only by the mutual threat of the Tyranids and liable to collapse the moment that threat is perceived to be diminished. And there is a deeper fear still. The fear that the Silent King's strategy will work too well, that the Tyranids will be defeated, the immediate threat eliminated, and then the galaxy will turn its attention to the Necrons. And the alliances that were built on common ground will dissolve into the same old enmities and territorial disputes that have defined galactic politics since the Necrons first went to sleep. The Silent King fears the Tyranids, but he also fears the world that will exist after the Tyranids are dealt with. Because in that world, the Necrons will be surrounded by species that have every reason to see them as the next great threat to galactic peace. The threats from outside the Necron species, the Tyranids and all they represent, are terrifying enough, but they are, in a sense, comprehensible. An external enemy can be studied, modeled, predicted, and perhaps even defeated. The fears that come from within are a different matter entirely. They are the cancers of the soul, the rot in the foundation. They're the slow poison working its way through the veins of a civilization that was already wounded before it began its long sleep. And of all the internal fears that plague the Necrons, none is more viscerally horrifying than the Flare virus. There is another fear that stalks the Necrons, and this one does not come from outside their civilization. It does not arrive on the wings of alien hive fleets or in the burning wake of warp storms. This fear lives within the Necrons themselves, embedded in their very being, like a splinter of glass buried so deep in living metal that no cryptex tool can extract it. It is the Flare virus, and the madness of the Destroyer cult, and the slow, creeping degradation of consciousness that turns lords into lunatics and warriors into monsters. It is the fear of what they are becoming, and it may be the most personal terror the Necrons face. Let us begin with the Flare virus, because it is perhaps the most viscerally horrifying thing in the entire Necron lexicon, and in a setting where horror is the default state of existence, that is a distinction worth noting. The story of the Flayer virus begins with a Citan called Landugor, the Flayer. When the Necrons finally turned against their Citan masters in the rebellion that followed the war in heaven, most of the star gods were shattered into fragments, Citan shards, that were then imprisoned in multidimensional tesseract labyrinths. These shards retained the personality and power of their original forms, but in much diminished measure, and they could be controlled, contained, weaponized when necessary. Most of the Citan met this fate, but Landugor was different. Yet the Silent King ordered the Necrons of the Maynarch dynasty to do something unprecedented. Rather than merely shattering the Flayer into shards, they were to destroy it utterly, to annihilate a being that was, in a very real sense, part of the fundamental fabric of reality. The Maynarch carried out this order, and Landugor was obliterated in a way that no other Citan had ever been. There are no shards of the Flayer locked away in tesseract labyrinths. There is no imprisoned god waiting to be unleashed on the battlefield. Landugor is gone. But in the final moments of its existence, as the energies that composed its being were torn apart and scattered to nothing, the Flayer did something terrible. It cursed the Necrons. With the last shreds of its dying consciousness, it screamed its hatred into the mechanical minds of its destroyers and embedded within them an echo of its own insatiable hunger. The Flayer's last words, preserved in the lore of the Necron species, are among the most chilling passages in all of Warhammer 40,000. It said, "To those who have turned their faces away, to those who are faithless and wretched in their jealousies, to those who have denied me, I will wreak vengeance. I will wrench your souls and break your bones. I will cast hunger through your accursed existence. Down the eons, you will not forget. I will grant you this gift from love turned aside and make you like me, break you in my image as you have broken me. I shall cast the fear of myself into you and all of your kind. I am Landugor. I am the hunger. I am the Flayer. And from this moment, you shall be too." And so the Flayer virus was born. It is a disease, though to call it that feels insufficient. It is a curse woven into the deepest coding of the Necron species, a malevolent echo of a dead god that has been spreading through the metallic population for millions of years, and there is no known cure. A Necron who succumbs to the Flayer virus undergoes a slow and agonizing erosion of their sanity. They begin to develop an obsessive fascination with organic flesh. Not in the way a scientist might study a specimen, but in the way a starving animal fixates on food it can never reach. The infected Necron becomes consumed by a desperate, irrational hunger for blood and gore, a craving so intense that it overrides every other thought and impulse. They begin to kill indiscriminately, not for tactical advantage or strategic purpose, but for the simple, horrible pleasure of being near dying flesh. And then they begin to collect it. Flayed ones, as these wretched creatures come to be known, drape themselves in the skin and viscera of their victims. They tear the flesh from the bodies of the fallen and wear it like clothing, pressing it against their necrodermis shells in a ghastly parody of the organic bodies they lost so long ago. Blood seeps through the gaps in their skeletal frames and pools at their feet. Sinew and muscle drape from their shoulders like grotesque capes. They cannot eat. They cannot digest. They cannot feel the warmth of the skin they so desperately crave. And yet they are compelled to collect it, to bathe in it, to try again and again to fill a void that can never be filled. There is a terrible pathos to the flayed ones that is easy to miss beneath the surface horror. These are beings that were once people. They were Necrontyr, who lived and loved and feared and hoped, and who were transformed against their will into machines, and who have now been transformed again, this time into something even worse. The hunger that drives them is, at its core, a twisted expression of the most fundamental Necron desire, the desire to be organic again. The flayed ones do not wear flesh because they enjoy it. They wear it because some broken, shattered fragment of their programming remembers what it was like to have a body, and they are driven by a compulsion they cannot resist to try to reclaim that experience, even though every attempt is doomed to failure. and the other Necrons are terrified of them. Not just because the flayed ones are violent and unpredictable, though they certainly are. Not just because they are a tactical liability on the battlefield, appearing and disappearing at random, attacking without coordination or purpose. The Necrons fear the flayed ones because the Flayer virus is contagious. It spreads through contact with the living metal of other Necrons, and some cryptechs believe it can even spread through proximity alone, through mere thought. Any Necron, from the lowliest warrior to the most exalted overlord, could succumb to the curse at any time. There is no way to predict who will be affected, no way to prevent it, and no way to reverse it once it has taken hold. This is why the flayed ones are outcasts. They are shunned by other Necrons, exiled from their dynasties, or driven to the fringes of Necron civilization, where they gather in festering enclaves and charnel houses. The most famous of these is the Bone Kingdom of Drazak, a nightmare realm located in the Ghoul stars, where almost every Necron is a flayed one. The kingdom is ruled by Valgul the Fallen Lord, who is said to be the only Necron to have contracted the Flayer virus and retained his sanity, though what kind of sanity allows someone to willingly rule over a kingdom of flesh-obsessed monstrosities is open to debate. Every few months, when the rotting flesh that decorates his subjects has decayed beyond even their ability to treasure it, Valgul announces a time of bounty and dispatches the fleets of Drazak to raid nearby worlds. The flayed ones descend upon populated planets in a frenzy of violence, tearing the inhabitants apart and harvesting their skin and organs with the mechanical precision of butchers operating in a slaughterhouse designed by a lunatic. Then they return to Drazak, their prizes dripping from their frames, and resume their endless, pointless vigil over a kingdom of bones and silence. For the Necron overlords and lords who still retain their faculties, the Flayer virus represents something far more frightening than a simple disease. It represents the fragility of their own minds. It is proof that the mechanical bodies they inhabit, the bodies that were supposed to grant them immortality and power, are not impervious to corruption. The biotransference was supposed to make them perfect. It was supposed to eliminate the weaknesses of flesh and replace them with the reliability of metal. But the Flayer virus demonstrates that the Necron mind, for all its mechanical precision, is still vulnerable to madness. It can still be broken. It can still be twisted into something unrecognizable. And the Flayer virus is not the only form of madness that plagues the Necrons. Let us turn now to the Destroyer cult, because if the flayed ones represent a fear of losing one's mind to an external curse, the Destroyers represent something even more disturbing. They represent a fear of losing one's mind to despair. The Necrons who join the Destroyer cult do so not because of a virus or a curse or any external influence. They do so because they wake from the great sleep and find themselves staring into the abyss of their own soulless existence, and something inside them breaks. The Destroyers are Necrons who have given up on the dream of organic restoration. They no longer hope for a return to flesh and blood. They no longer seek redemption or renewal, or anything that could be called positive in any meaningful sense. They have looked at the reality of their existence, at the cold metal shell that contains whatever is left of their consciousness, and they have decided that there is only one appropriate response: the eradication of all organic life in the galaxy. This is not a reasoned philosophical position, though some Destroyers are capable of articulating it in disturbingly logical terms. It is a form of madness, a nihilistic psychosis that strips away everything except the desire to kill. As the Destroyers task the cryptechs of their tomb worlds with modifying their bodies to become more efficient killing machines, they replace their limbs with weapons. They fuse their torsos to anti-gravity platforms for greater mobility. They transform themselves deliberately and methodically into instruments of destruction so pure in purpose that they cease to be anything else. What makes the Destroyer cult so frightening to other Necrons is not the violence itself. The Necrons are a warrior species. They understand violence. They respect it in their way. What frightens them is the motivation behind it. The Destroyers have abandoned every goal, every ambition, every shred of purpose that defines Necron civilization. They do not seek to rebuild the dynasty. They do not seek to reclaim lost territories. But they do not seek to reverse biotransference or restore the glory of the ancient empire. They seek only to destroy, and in that destruction, they find a kind of terrible peace. And the really unsettling part is that destroyer cults have appeared on every single tomb world that has awakened. Every dynasty, every world, every social stratum has produced members of the destroyer cult. This is not a localized phenomenon. It is not a regional quirk or a dynastic peculiarity. It is a fundamental flaw in the Necron species, a crack that runs through the entire foundation of their civilization. Whatever process created the Necrons, whatever the biotransference did to the Necron-tire mind, it left behind a vulnerability that manifests as this specific form of nihilistic insanity, and it affects beings at every level of Necron society. And even the nobility are not safe. When a Necron lord or overlord succumbs to the destroyer madness, the result is a being of immense power and intelligence that is utterly devoted to the extinction of all life. These destroyer lords combine the tactical acumen and military resources of a Necron noble with the single-minded, kill-everything determination of a destroyer, and the combination is catastrophic. They lead vast destroyer cults on campaigns of extermination that strip entire worlds of every living thing down to the bacterial level. They boil oceans with their weapons. They sterilize continents. They do not stop, ever, until every last microorganism has been scoured from the planet's surface. And here is the detail that makes it even worse. The destroyer cult is spreading. More Necrons are falling to the madness now than ever before. Beings who showed no signs of the affliction before the Great Sleep are succumbing to it after awakening. The touch of the destroyer curse is reaching further into Necron society than it ever has, and no one knows why. Some cryptexts theorize that the madness is an inherent consequence of the biotransference, a flaw so deeply embedded in the Necron psyche that it was always destined to manifest given enough time. Others believe it is a subconscious imperative, a hidden directive written into the Necron programming by the Citan as a safeguard against rebellion, now slowly activating as the Necrons awaken from their 60 million year slumber. Whatever the cause, the result is the same. The Necrons face a slow internal rot that threatens to consume them from within. The Flayer virus and the Destroyer cult are not external enemies that can be confronted and defeated. They are aspects of the Necron condition itself, consequences of the terrible bargain that created the species in the first place. And every Necron lord who retains enough of their faculties to understand what is happening looks upon the flayed ones and the destroyers and sees a possible version of their own future, a mirror showing what they might become if their grip on sanity loosens, if the mechanical emptiness of their existence finally becomes too much to bear. There is a passage from the law that captures this fear with devastating clarity. A Necron noble, describing the destroyers, says, "They are weapons, nothing more, and should be expended as such. They are Necron in form only. Having been reborn to a madness deeper than any other to which I have borne witness. Whilst I hold nothing but approval for their drive and efficiency, I can present no logic adequate to justify their ultimate goal. A warrior's proper function is to fight for a profound objective, to leave behind works or deeds greater than himself. Given free rein, the destroyers would leave behind nothing, not life, nor art, nor glory. Only dust would remain. I am a soulless machine, yet even I feel pity for their victims." Read that last sentence again. I am a soulless machine, yet even I feel pity. This is a being without a soul, a being who has been stripped of virtually everything that makes consciousness worthwhile, and yet it can still recognize the horror of what the destroyers have become. It can still feel something, some echo of compassion, some remnant of the capacity for moral judgment that the biotransference was supposed to have eliminated. And it uses that remnant to look at the destroyers and feel afraid. Because if even a soulless machine can go mad, then what protection does any Necron have? If even the cold perfection of a mechanical mind can be twisted into something that lives only to kill, then the immortality the Necrons paid so dearly for is not a gift at all. It is a cage with no lock, a sentence with no end, and the prisoner is slowly losing the ability to tell the difference between the cage and the self. This fear of internal corruption, of becoming something monstrous through no fault of one's own, is compounded by the specific case of Necrosor Amentar, the most feared of all the Destroyer Lords. Thus, Amentar is a being whose very existence other Necrons regard as a myth or a parable. So terrifying is the truth of what it represents. All memories of Amentar's origin have been forcibly removed from the collective Necron consciousness, and only the Silent King himself possesses the command protocols that could have made such sweeping modifications to his species' memory. That fact alone is staggering. Whatever Amentar was, wherever it came from, the Silent King considered the knowledge so dangerous that he erased it from the minds of every Necron in existence. What we do know is that Amentar is afflicted by the Destroyer madness. But unlike other Destroyers, its advanced mind has not been entirely consumed by the urge to kill. It retains intelligence, cunning, and worst of all, ambition. Whilst it has developed an almost religious obsession with the Citan known as the Nightbringer, the most dangerous of all the star gods, and has dedicated itself to gathering every scattered shard of the Nightbringer in order to reassemble it into its full, terrible form. This is a goal that virtually every other faction in the galaxy, including the Necrons, would oppose with everything they have, because a fully reconstituted Nightbringer would be a threat to all existence. And the truly chilling thing about Amentar is its ability to infect other Necrons with the Destroyer madness simply through proximity. Its mere presence is enough to corrupt the minds of Necrons around it, from the lowliest warrior to the most exalted overlord. It does not need to argue or persuade or coerce. It simply exists, and in its existence, as it spreads the madness that defines it. It is a walking contagion of nihilism, and it cannot be stopped because the very Necrons sent to stop it are at risk of being turned into its servants. This is what the Necrons fear when they contemplate their own internal threats. Not just the individual horror of the flayed ones or the destroyers, but the pattern they represent. The slow, inevitable degradation of a species that was already broken when it was created. The knowledge that immortality does not mean stability, that existing forever does not protect you from losing yourself, and that the longer you persist in a state of being that was never meant to be permanent, the more likely it is that something fundamental within you will fail. And now we must turn to perhaps the deepest and most personal fear that haunts the Necron species. Deeper than the Tyrannid threat, more intimate than the madness of the Flayer virus, more fundamental than anything that any external enemy could inflict upon them. We need to talk about the Citan. The relationship between the Necrons and the Citan is not simply one of former master and rebellious slave. It is far more complicated, far more painful, and far more frightening than that simple narrative suggests. The Citan made the Necrons. They designed the process that stripped away the Necrontier's flesh and consumed their souls. They shaped the mechanical bodies that the Necrons would inhabit for eternity. In a very real sense, the Citan are the Necrons' creators, and the Necrons owe their existence, such as it is, to the star gods they rose up against. But the Necrons also know what the Citan took from them. They know that their souls, the very essence of what made them living beings rather than mere machines, were devoured by creatures that saw them as nothing more than a particularly tasty meal. This knowledge burns within the Necron consciousness like a cold flame, a fury so deep and so old that it has become part of the fundamental programming of the species. The Necrons hate the Citan with an intensity that transcends rational thought. They hate them for the betrayal. They hate them for the theft of their souls. They hate them for the promise of immortality that turned out to be a prison sentence from which there is no parole. And they fear them. Because the Citan, even in their diminished, shattered state, are still among the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Each Citan shard, even the smallest fragment of the original star gods, possesses reality-warping abilities that can turn the tide of entire battles. They can manipulate matter at the atomic level, bend time, project energies that can disintegrate armies in an instant. The Necrons use these shards as weapons, releasing them from their tesseract labyrinths when the situation on the battlefield becomes desperate enough to warrant the risk. But make no mistake, using a Citan shard is always a risk. Always. Because the shards remember. Each fragment of a Citan retains the personality and the grudges of the original entity, and they are furious. They are imprisoned gods, chained and humiliated by the very servants they once treated as chattel, and they want revenge. Every time a Citan shard is released onto the battlefield, there is a chance, small but never zero, that it will slip its bonds and turn on its captors. The mechanisms that control the shards are sophisticated, designed by the finest cryptex over millions of years, but they are not infallible. Causality itself was damaged by the forces unleashed during the original shattering of the Citan, and the knowledge of how those terrible weapons worked was deliberately erased from Necron memory by the Silent King, who feared what might be done with it. This means that the Necrons are, in essence, carrying their greatest enemies around with them at all times. The Citan shards are imprisoned within the very infrastructure of Necron civilization, bound into the devices that power their tomb worlds and fuel their most devastating weapons. The Dais of Dominion, the throne from which the Silent King himself rules, is powered by a captured shard of the Citan known as Nyadrazatha. The Necrons sit atop a powder keg of imprisoned godhood, and every time they light the fuse by releasing a shard in battle, they are gambling that the fuse will not burn all the way down. The fear is not hypothetical. There have been documented cases of Citan shards breaking free from their prisons. When this happens, the results are catastrophic. A freed shard is a being of terrible power and even more terrible rage, and it has millions of years of captivity to avenge. Some freed shards have been recaptured, but only at enormous cost. Others have disappeared into the galaxy, hiding and plotting and gathering strength, waiting for the moment when they can strike back at their former captors. And lurking at the edges of this fear is an even greater terror. The possibility that the Citan might be reassembled. The shards of each star god retain an affinity for one another. They are drawn together like fragments of a broken magnet, and if enough shards were to be gathered in one place, they could potentially merge back into something approaching the original entity's full power. A reconstituted Citan would be a being of virtually limitless power, a god in the most literal sense of the word, and it would have a very specific and very personal grudge against the species that broke it apart in the first place. This is why the Necrons react with such intense alarm when anyone, whether other Necrons or outside forces, begins gathering Citan shards. The possibility of a reconstituted star god is one of the few things that can unite otherwise hostile Necron dynasties in common cause. It is a threat that transcends political rivalries and dynastic grudges, because a fully restored Citan would not distinguish between one dynasty and another. It would see only the species that had imprisoned it for millions of years, and its vengeance would be total. The Nightbringer, Azagorod, is perhaps the most feared of all the Catan in this regard. Even in its shattered state, the Nightbringer's shards remain among the most dangerous and difficult to control entities the Necrons possess. Star systems, planets, and entire civilizations have fallen before its dark scythe, and even the Necrons fear it. The Nightbringer is death itself, and the being that planted the fear of mortality into the collective unconscious of nearly every species in the galaxy during the War in Heaven. Every intelligent race in the galaxy, with the notable exception of the Orcs, carries an instinctive primal terror of death that was placed there by the Nightbringer millions of years ago. When humans picture the Grim Reaper, when they imagine a skeletal figure in robes carrying a scythe, they are seeing an image that was burned into their ancestors' genetic memory by the Nightbringer's slaughter, and now beings like Necros or Amantar are actively trying to reassemble it. The greatest fear of the Necron species, the resurrection of the gods they overthrew, is being pursued by members of their own kind. Insane destroyer lords and mad cryptechs and deranged overlords are all driven by various forms of the madness that infects Necron society, working to undo the single greatest achievement of the Necron rebellion. The Satan fear is unique among the Necron's terrors because it is simultaneously historical and immediate, distant and intimate. The Satan are part of the Necron's past, the architects of their transformation and the devourers of their souls. But they are also part of the Necron's present, imprisoned within their technology, deployed as weapons on their battlefields, constantly testing the limits of their confinement. And they are potentially part of the Necron's future, a looming catastrophe that could be triggered at any moment by a single failure in the elaborate systems of containment that keep them bound. The Necrons fear the Satan because the Satan represent the consequences of their original mistake. The bargain that created the Necrons also created the conditions for their potential destruction, and the instruments of that destruction are locked away in vaults beneath their feet, whispering promises of vengeance that can be heard by anyone who listens too closely. Let us dive deeper into the horror of the Flayer virus, because the surface-level description, while terrifying, does not capture the full existential weight of what this affliction represents to the Necron species. Consider what it means to be a flayed one. You are a being of living metal, a consciousness trapped inside a body that cannot taste, cannot smell, cannot feel the warmth of skin against skin. You are a remnant of a species that once knew all of these things, that once lived and breathed and experienced the world through senses that have been replaced by mechanical sensors. And now something has broken inside you. Some fundamental aspect of your programming has been corrupted, and you are driven by an overwhelming, all-consuming need to feel those things again. But you cannot. You will never be able to. The flesh you drape across your metal frame gives you nothing. No warmth, no sensation, no relief from the hunger that gnaws at whatever passes for your soul. You are Tantalus in the pool, reaching for water that recedes from your lips, reaching for fruit that draws away from your hands, condemned to an eternity of reaching and never grasping. There is a theory among some Necron cryptechs that the Flayer virus is not actually a disease in any conventional sense, that it is, instead, as an accelerated and pathological expression of a desire that exists in every Necron, the desire to be organic again. The flayed ones are not anomalies. They are what happens when the perfectly natural, perfectly understandable longing for a return to flesh and blood is amplified to the point of madness. They are the extreme end of a spectrum that every self-aware Necron exists on, and that is what makes them so frightening. Not the blood, not the skin, not the shambling, clawed monstrosities they become, but the knowledge that the seed of the Flayer curse exists in every single Necron, waiting to germinate. The Twice Dead King novels explore this with particular depth and sensitivity. The protagonist, Oltix, is a Necron royal who discovers over the course of the story that he himself is infected with the Flayer virus. The revelation is not a sudden, dramatic twist. It is a slow, creeping realization, a growing awareness that something is wrong with the way he processes certain stimuli, that his reactions to the sight and smell of blood and flesh are not quite what they should be, that the hunger he feels when he witnesses violence is not the cold satisfaction of tactical success, but something warmer, something more primal, something that should not exist in a being of metal and circuits. Oltix's response to this realization is one of the most psychologically complex and emotionally powerful sequences in all of Warhammer 40,000 literature. He does not surrender to the madness. He does not give up. He fights it, tooth and claw, every moment of every day, exerting every ounce of his will to keep the hunger at bay, or to maintain his sense of self in the face of a corruption that is literally rewriting his consciousness. And the tragedy of his struggle is that he knows he will probably lose. The Flayer virus has no known cure. Every Necron who has contracted it has eventually succumbed. Ultix's battle against the curse is a war he is almost certainly doomed to lose, and he fights it anyway, because the alternative is to become something that horrifies him more than death. This is the fear that the Flayer virus represents, not just the loss of sanity, but the loss of dignity. The loss of the ability to choose who you are and what you stand for. The transformation from a being with agency and purpose into a creature driven by compulsions it cannot resist and desires it cannot fulfill. For a species that has already lost so much, that has already been stripped of its flesh and its soul and its connection to everything that once gave life meaning, the prospect of losing even the remnant of self that remains, the ghost of a personality clinging to existence inside a mechanical shell, is the final indignity. It is the last thing the Necrons have, and the Flayer virus threatens to take it away. The Maynarch dynasty, the Necrons who were ordered by the Silent King to destroy Landugor, and who were cursed for their obedience, occupy a uniquely tragic position in this narrative. They did what their king asked of them. They followed orders. They destroyed a being of terrible power because the legitimate authority of their species commanded it. And their reward was to be cursed, to be marked for madness, and to have the Flayer virus embedded more deeply in their dynasty than in any other. The Maynarch were punished for their loyalty, and the injustice of that punishment echoes through the ages, a reminder that in the Necron universe, doing the right thing and doing the safe thing are often not the same thing. The Maynarch are known even before the war in heaven for their savagery and malice. They were fierce, they were brutal, and they were exactly the kind of warriors you would want on your side when the order came down to destroy a god. But the curse has twisted them further, amplifying the violence that was already part of their nature into something pathological and self-destructive. Even those members of the dynasty who have not fully succumbed to the Flayer virus are marked by it, their aggression heightened, their hunger sharpened, their grip on sanity more tenuous than it should be for beings of their age and experience. They are a dynasty living on borrowed time, fighting a battle they cannot win against an enemy that lives inside them. And the rest of the Necron species watches them and is afraid. Because if it can happen to the Maynarch, it can happen to anyone. If a dynasty that was merely following orders can be cursed with madness, then what protection does loyalty offer? What security does obedience provide? The Flayer virus does not discriminate between the faithful and the faithless, between the brave and the cowardly, between the just and the unjust. It strikes where it wills, and where it strikes, it destroys. The Satan shards, imprisoned in their tesseract labyrinths, are frightening enough. The notion that these fragments of gods might escape their containment and seek revenge against their captors is the kind of existential threat that keeps Necron overlords cycling through worst-case tactical scenarios during periods that might, in a charitable interpretation, be called sleep. But there are two specific Satan whose stories elevate this fear from the general to the particular, from abstract possibility to concrete, personalized nightmare. Among the Satan that the Necrons shattered and imprisoned, there are two whose stories deserve special attention, because they represent fears that go beyond the general dread of a freed star god. They represent specific, individualized terrors that have haunted the Necron species since the earliest days of their mechanical existence. The first is Tsaranoga, the Outsider. As among all the Satan, the Outsider occupies a unique and uniquely terrifying position. According to the ancient Eldari text, known as the Book of Mournful Night, the Outsider may in fact remain the sole intact Khitan. It was not shattered like its brethren. It was not broken into shards and imprisoned in tesseract labyrinths. Instead, it was driven mad, tricked by the deceiver into consuming other Satan during the fratricidal wars that erupted among the star gods before the Necron rebellion. The act of devouring its own kind, of absorbing the consciousnesses of beings that were its equals and its siblings, drove the Outsider into a state of insanity so profound that even the other Satan feared it. and then it disappeared. The outsider withdrew from the galaxy entirely, or retreating into a massive construct known as the Dyson Sphere that orbits in the halo of the galaxy, far from any inhabited system, far from any world where its presence might be detected. There it remains, if the legends are to be believed, a fully intact star god of immeasurable power, driven utterly and completely insane by the memories and personalities of the Satan it consumed, screaming silently into the void in a madness that has lasted for 60 million years. For the Necrons, the outsider is a bogeyman, a story told in the deepest chambers of the tomb worlds, whispered between cryptecs who have spent centuries studying the records of the war in heaven and who have found references to the outsider that make their sophisticated threat assessment protocols register something very close to panic. It's because the outsider is not imprisoned. It is not contained. It is not under anyone's control. It is out there, somewhere in the darkness at the edge of the galaxy, and no one knows what it is doing, what it is thinking, or what it might decide to do if it ever decides to return. A fully intact Satan is a being of power that beggars description. The shards that the Necrons deploy as weapons are tiny fragments of the originals, and even those fragments can turn the tide of entire campaigns. A complete, undivided star god would be capable of things that the current inhabitants of the galaxy can barely conceive of. It could reshape worlds. It could extinguish stars. It could rewrite the fundamental laws of physics in its immediate vicinity and impose its will on reality itself. And the outsider is not just a fully intact Satan, or it is a fully intact Satan that has consumed other Satan, absorbing their power and their essence. It is potentially the most powerful single entity in the material universe, and it is insane. The fear that the outsider inspires in the Necrons is not the fear of a rational enemy who can be predicted and countered. It is the fear of chaos itself, of a being whose actions are governed by a madness so deep and so alien that no amount of strategic planning or tactical preparation can account for what it might do. The outsider could return to the galaxy tomorrow and begin destroying everything in its path, and the Necrons would have no way to stop it. They do not possess the weapons that were used to shatter the other Satan. Those weapons were deliberately scrubbed from their memory by the Silent King, who feared that the knowledge of how to unmake a god might be misused. And even if they did possess such weapons, using them against the outsider would require confronting a being whose power dwarfs anything the galaxy has seen since the height of the war in heaven. Some Necron scholars believe the outsider is already dead, or at least dormant, its madness having consumed it to the point where it can no longer function. Others believe it is very much active, and that its Dyson Sphere is not a prison, but a workshop, a place where it is building something, preparing something, working towards some incomprehensible goal that only a mind twisted by millions of years of insanity could conceive. And a few, the most pessimistic and perhaps the most perceptive, believe that the outsider is already influencing events in the galaxy, that its madness has a reach that extends far beyond its physical location, and that some of the seemingly random catastrophes that have befallen the Necrons over the millennia are not random at all, but the results of a plan so vast and so deranged that it looks like coincidence to anyone who cannot see the whole picture. Whatever the truth, the outsider remains one of the Necrons' greatest fears. It is the fear of the unknown, magnified to a cosmic scale. The fear that somewhere out there, beyond the reach of their senses and the range of their weapons, something immensely powerful and utterly unpredictable is waiting. The second Satan that deserves special attention is Magladroth, the Void Dragon. The Void Dragon's story is different from the outsiders, but no less frightening. And because the Void Dragon is not lurking at the edge of the galaxy, the Void Dragon, or at least a significant shard of it, may be much, much closer to the centers of galactic power than anyone is comfortable thinking about. There is a theory, whispered in the most secretive chambers of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and dismissed by most Imperial scholars as dangerous heresy, that a shard of the Void Dragon is imprisoned on Mars. The theory suggests that the machine god worshipped by the Mechanicus, the deity in whose name the tech priests maintain the technology of the Imperium and conduct their sacred rituals of maintenance and manufacture, is not an aspect of the Emperor of Mankind at all. It is the Void Dragon, a Satan shard, imprisoned beneath the red surface of Mars since before the dawn of human civilization. Its influence seeping upward through millions of years of accumulated technology, subtly shaping the course of human technological development and inspiring the worship of machines that would eventually become the foundation of the Adeptus Mechanicus. If this theory is true, and the evidence for it is suggestive if not conclusive, then the implications for the Necrons are staggering. It would mean that one of the most powerful Satan shards in existence is not safely locked away in a Tesseract labyrinth under Necron control. It is on the homeworld of humanity's technological priesthood, potentially influencing the development and direction of one of the galaxy's most powerful institutions. It would mean that the Necron's former master has been operating, in some diminished but still significant capacity, right under the noses of the species that now dominates the galaxy. And it would mean that any attempt by the Necrons to reclaim or contain the Void Dragon Shard would bring them into direct conflict with the Adeptus Mechanicus, and by extension, the entire Imperium of Mankind. The Void Dragon is feared by the Necrons not just for its power, but for its intelligence. Among the Satan, the Void Dragon was renowned for its mastery of technology and material science. It was the Void Dragon that provided the foundational knowledge for the construction of necrodermis, the living metal that forms the bodies of every Necron in existence. In a very real sense, the Void Dragon designed the bodies that the Necrons inhabit. It understood the principles of their construction on a level that no Necron cryptech has ever matched. Because it was the original architect, the being that conceived of the material and the methods that would transform the Necrontire from organic beings into mechanical immortals. This means that the Void Dragon understands the Necrons in ways that other Satan do not. It knows their bodies, it knows their weaknesses, it knows the vulnerabilities that are built into their necrodermis shells because it helped build them. If the Void Dragon were ever freed from its imprisonment, if it were ever able to act with the full force of its intelligence and its power, it would have an intimate, detailed understanding of every aspect of Necron physiology and technology, and it would be able to exploit that understanding with devastating effectiveness. This is the specific terror that the Void Dragon inspires us, not just the general fear of a freed Catan, though that is terrifying enough, but the fear of a being that knows you, that built you, that designed every aspect of your physical form and understands its limitations better than you do. It is the fear of facing an enemy who holds the blueprints to your existence and who has every reason to use that knowledge against you. We have walked through the material fears of the Necrons, the biological threat of the Tyranids, the pathological horror of the Flayer virus, the raw destructive potential of the Satan, both imprisoned and free. But the Necrons exist in a galaxy where the material universe is only half the story. There is another dimension, a realm of thought and emotion and terrible power that shapes events as surely as any fleet or army. And the Necrons' relationship with that realm is perhaps the most paradoxical and unsettling aspect of their entire existence. Now we come to a fear that is, in some ways, more abstract than the others we have discussed, but no less potent for its abstraction. We need to talk about the warp and why the Necrons, who have no connection to it whatsoever, are nonetheless deeply and justifiably terrified of what it represents. The warp, the Imperium, the Sea of Souls, whatever name you give it, is the dimension of psychic energy that underlies all of physical reality in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. It is the source of all psychic power, the realm where demons dwell, the medium through which most species travel faster than light, and the domain of the four chaos gods, whose influence corrupts and destroys everything it touches. For most species in the galaxy, the warp is simultaneously the greatest tool and the greatest threat they possess. Humanity, for instance, cannot function as a galactic civilization without the warp. Faster than light travel, long-range communication, the very survival of the Imperium, all depend on the warp in fundamental ways. But the warp is also the source of the demonic invasions, the psychic plagues, the corruption and mutation that threatens to destroy humanity from within. The Necrons have no connection to the warp at all. They are, in a very real sense, the most anti-warp species in existence. The biotransference that stripped away their flesh also stripped away their souls, and without souls, the Necrons have no presence in the Immaterium. They cannot use psychic powers, they cannot be possessed by demons. They cannot be corrupted by chaos in the way that organic species can. From the perspective of the warp and its inhabitants, the Necrons barely exist. They are blind spots in the fabric of reality, negative spaces where the Immaterium cannot reach. This might sound like an advantage, and in many ways it is. The Necrons are effectively immune to most forms of chaos corruption, which is a gift beyond measure in a galaxy where chaos is the single greatest existential threat to virtually every other civilization. While the Imperium tears itself apart fighting demon invasions and heretical cults, while the Eldari live in constant terror of Slaanesh, while even the Orcs and the Tyranids are affected by the warp in various ways, the Necrons walk through the galaxy untouched by the temptations and terrors of the Immaterium. They are, in this one regard, perfectly protected. But immunity to corruption is not the same as immunity to damage, and this is where the Necrons' fear of the warp begins. Because while the Necrons cannot be corrupted by chaos, they are deeply vulnerable to psychic attacks. Their soulless nature, the very thing that protects them from demonic possession and chaotic influence, also means that they have virtually no defense against the raw, destructive power of the warp when it is directed against them. A Psyker can hurl bolts of psychic energy at a Necron, and the Necron cannot counter with its own psychic defenses, because it has none. A demon can engage a Necron in combat, and while the daemon cannot possess the Necron or corrupt its mind, it can certainly tear it apart with claws made of solidified malice and warp-spawned fury. The Necron's lack of a psychic presence cuts both ways. It makes them invisible to certain forms of warp detection, yes, but it also makes them unable to defend themselves against certain forms of warp-based attack. The Necrons have technological solutions to this problem, of course. Their mastery of physical science is so advanced that they can replicate many of the effects of psychic power through purely mechanical means. Cryptex can manipulate matter and energy in ways that seem indistinguishable from sorcery to less advanced species. And the Necrons possess a substance called Blackstone, or Noctilith in the High Gothic of the Imperium, which has the remarkable property of being able to suppress or amplify warp energies depending on how it is configured. The Cadian pylons. Those great constructs that held back the Eye of Terror for millennia were originally Necron-built devices crafted from negatively charged Blackstone. The Pariah Nexus, the vast array of Blackstone pylons being constructed by the Silent King's Zarakan dynasty in the Nephilim sector, represents the Necrons' most ambitious attempt yet to use this technology to push back against the warp on a galactic scale. But the warp is not a static threat that can be walled off and forgotten. It is a living, seething, constantly evolving dimension of nightmare, and its agents are endlessly creative in their methods of destruction. The opening of the Great Rift, that colossal tear in the fabric of reality that now bisects the galaxy like a wound that will not heal, has dramatically amplified the warp's influence on the material universe. Warp storms rage through sectors that were previously calm. Demon incursions occur with terrifying frequency. The barrier between the Immaterium and real space, already thin in many places, has been stretched to the breaking point. For the Necrons, the Great Rift is a crisis on multiple levels. First, there is the practical problem of the warp storms disrupting Necron operations. While the Necrons do not use the warp for faster-than-light travel, relying instead on technologies like the Dolmen Gates that hack into the Eldari webway, they are still affected by the turbulence that the Great Rift generates in real space. Communications between tomb worlds have been disrupted. Isolated dynasties have been cut off from each other. But the carefully orchestrated plan to awaken the Necron Empire in a coordinated fashion has been thrown into chaos by the literal chaos pouring through the rift. But the strategic implications of the Great Rift extend far beyond mere logistical inconvenience. The warp, left unchecked, has the potential to literally tear reality apart. If the Great Rift continues to expand, if the barrier between the immaterium and real space continues to erode, the physical universe as the Necrons know it could be consumed by the raw stuff of chaos. And in a universe drowning in warp energy, with demons running rampant across every world, and the laws of physics themselves breaking down under the weight of unreality, what happens to the Necrons? They survive. In a sense, their bodies are indestructible. Their technology advanced enough to function even in the most extreme conditions. But they survive in a galaxy that has been fundamentally, irrevocably changed. A galaxy where the warp has won, where chaos reigns supreme, where every organic species has either been destroyed or corrupted beyond recognition. In such a universe, the Necrons would endure forever, soulless and alone, surrounded by nothing but demons and the howling madness of the Imperium. They would be immortal prisoners in a reality that has been transformed into a prison, and there would be no escape, not in 1,000 years, not in 1,000,000, not ever. This is why the Silent King has made the Pariah Nexus project one of his highest priorities. The Pariah Nexus is not just a weapon or a defensive measure. Yes, it is a desperate attempt to push back against the tide of chaos before it becomes too late. The vast network of black stone pylons being constructed in the Nephilim sector creates a zone of space completely free from the warp's influence. A region where psychic powers do not function, where demons cannot manifest, where the Immaterium has been sealed away behind a wall of negatively charged noctilith, so complete that even human souls are suppressed within its boundaries. The effects on the organic species caught within the Pariah Nexus are devastating. Without a connection to the warp, humans lose their will, their motivation, their very sense of self. Entire populations have been reduced to listless, catatonic shells, unable to muster the energy even to feed themselves or flee from the Necron forces that move among them. Psykers, who rely on the warp for their abilities, are rendered completely powerless. Even Space Marines, those genetically enhanced post-human warriors who represent the pinnacle of human martial capability, find themselves diminished within the Nexus, their faith and fury muted by the smothering absence of the warp. This is the Necrons' answer to the threat of chaos. Not to fight the warp on its own terms, because the Necrons cannot do that. Not to match psychic power with psychic power, because the Necrons have no psychic power to match. But to simply remove the warp from the equation entirely. To build a wall around reality so thick and so complete that the Immaterium cannot reach through it. And to expand that wall until it encompasses the entire galaxy. If the Necrons succeed, chaos will be permanently cut off from the material universe. All demons will be unable to manifest. Psykers will lose their powers. The Great Rift will collapse. The threat of the ruinous powers will be eliminated forever. But the cost of that success would be enormous. A galaxy without the warp is a galaxy without souls. Every organic species with a psychic connection, which is to say, virtually every organic species in existence, would be profoundly affected. The Aeldari, whose entire culture and biology is built around their psychic connection, would be devastated. Humanity, which depends on the warp for interstellar travel and communication, would be shattered into millions of isolated, disconnected worlds. Even the Orcs, whose peculiar psychic gestalt is what holds their ramshackle technology together, would be diminished. And there is the bitter irony. The Necrons, while in their attempt to protect reality from the warp, would also be destroying the very organic life they need to achieve their goal of reversing biotransference. A galaxy cleansed of warp influence would be a galaxy where the biological complexity necessary for consciousness transfer might be fundamentally compromised. The Necrons would save reality by killing everything that makes it worth saving. This tension between the need to combat chaos and the need to preserve organic life is one of the central paradoxes of the Necron condition. and it feeds into a fear that goes beyond any single threat. It is the fear that the Necrons are trapped in a situation with no good options, that every path forward leads to some form of defeat, and that the immortality they purchased at such terrible cost has only given them eternity to contemplate the impossibility of their situation. Now let us turn to something even more intimate, more personal. We have talked about the Tyranids and their threat to the Necrons' future. We have talked about the Flayer virus and the Destroyer cult and their threat to the Necrons' sanity. We have talked about the C'tan and their threat to the Necrons' safety. We have talked about the warp and its threat to the Necrons' reality. But there is one more fear that we have not yet addressed directly, and it is in many ways the most devastating of all. The Necrons are afraid of losing themselves, not in the abstract, philosophical sense, though that is certainly part of it, in the concrete, measurable, and observable sense of watching their own identity erode across the centuries like a coastal cliff being eaten by the sea. The Necrons who retained their consciousness through the biotransference, the lords and overlords and cryptex who were given the advanced circuitry necessary to preserve their personalities and memories, are not preserved perfectly. They are preserved approximately. They are copies of the people they once were, and like all copies, they degrade over time. This is one of the most poignant aspects of Necron lore, and it is explored with devastating emotional depth in novels like the Twice Dead King series by Nate Crowley. The Necrons remember their time as the Necron Tyre, but they remember it poorly. Specific events are hazy, faces blur. The emotional context of experiences, the feelings that gave those experiences meaning, fades until all that remains is a dry recitation of facts stripped of any personal significance. A Necron lord might remember that it once had a family, but the memory of what it felt like to love them is gone. It might remember fighting in battles as a Necron tier warrior, but the adrenaline, the fear, the exhilaration that made those battles meaningful has been replaced by nothing. And with each awakening from the great sleep, the degradation worsens. The organic components of Necron consciousness, whatever biological substrate still supports the upper-level functions of their minds, continues to deteriorate. Memories that were clear after the first awakening become murky after the second. Faces that were recognizable become anonymous. And the sense of self that defines individual identity becomes thinner and more fragile, like ice on a warming lake, until eventually it threatens to dissolve entirely. Nate Crowley described this beautifully in his discussions of the Necron mindset. Every single high-ranking Necron is having to come to terms with existing eternally in a body completely alien to the one its mind evolved to sit within. That is a recipe for abject madness, if ever there was one. And it is not something which, as a species, they have any idea how to cope with. It is something every individual has to either find their own solution to or lose their minds. The solutions that individual Necrons have found are as varied as the individuals themselves, and many of them are deeply dysfunctional. Some Necron lords have become obsessive collectors. Like Trizin the Infinite, who has spent millions of years filling his galleries with artifacts and specimens from across the galaxy in what amounts to a cosmic-scale hoarding compulsion, designed to fill the void left by the loss of genuine emotional experience. Others have retreated into rigid adherence to protocol and tradition, following the rules and customs of their ancient dynasties with a mechanical precision that serves as a substitute for genuine purpose. Still others have developed eccentricities that border on full-blown madness, reenacting scenes from their mortal lives with elaborate props and unwilling participants, or developing paranoid fixations that consume their entire existence. The Twice Dead King novels follow a Necron royal named Oltix, and through his experiences, we see the horror of this identity erosion in intimate detail. Oltix is confronted repeatedly with moments of self-realization so raw and agonizing that they would be painful to witness, even in a being of flesh and blood. There are moments where he is suddenly, viscerally aware that he cannot breathe, that the body he inhabits has no lungs, no heart, no warmth, and the panic that this realization produces is described not as a machine error or a programming glitch, but as the authentic, overwhelming terror of a conscious being trapped in a prison of metal and silence. The Cetan, in their cruelty, apparently included pain receptors in the Necron bodies they designed. This detail, confirmed by the author, is described as nothing less than a deliberate act of malice. The Cetan wanted the Necrons to suffer. They wanted them to feel the cold of their metal shells, the absence of sensation, the hollow silence where a heartbeat should be. This was not an oversight or a design limitation. It was a feature, built into the Necron form with the same loving attention to detail that a torturer might devote to the construction of a new instrument of agony. And so the Necrons exist in a state of permanent, low-grade horror. They are conscious enough to know what they have lost, but not conscious enough to fully feel the loss. They remember enough of their organic lives to understand that something is missing, but not enough to reconstruct what that something was. They are haunted by the ghosts of sensations they can no longer experience, by the echoes of emotions they can no longer feel, by the shadows of memories they can no longer access. This is what drives so many Necron lords to madness. Not the Flayer virus, not the Destroyer cult, not any external threat or supernatural curse. Simply the grinding, relentless pressure of existing in a state that the mind was never designed to endure. The Necron consciousness evolved to inhabit an organic body. It evolved to process sensory input from eyes and ears and skin and tongue. It evolved to generate and respond to emotions, to form memories encoded in the complex electrochemistry of a biological brain. And then all of that was taken away and replaced with sensors and circuits and data storage, and the consciousness was left to cope as best it could with a reality that bore no resemblance to the one it was built to handle. Some Necrons cope by forgetting. They allow the memories of their organic lives to fade, and in the fading, they find a kind of peace. They become more machine and less person, and in that transformation, the gap between what they are and what they were designed to be narrows. It is, in a sense, the kindest possible outcome, but it is also a kind of death. The person who went into the biotransference is not preserved. They are erased, slowly and gently, and what remains is something that bears their name and shares their rank, but is not, in any meaningful sense, them. Others cope by holding on. They fight against the erosion with everything they have, clinging to memories and emotions and identity with the same desperate intensity that a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood. These are the Necrons who suffer the most, because they are the ones who fully understand what is happening to them and cannot accept it. And they are the ones who wake from stasis and immediately check their memories, cataloging what has been lost, mourning each faded face and each dimmed emotion as though attending the funeral of a loved one. They are the ones who choose to feel the pain of their existence rather than allowing the machine to smooth it away. And their reward for this courage is a special kind of agony that no other species in the galaxy can fully comprehend. And then there are those who cope by going mad, and we have already discussed what happens then. The flayed ones, who try to rebuild their organic bodies from the corpses of others. The destroyers, who decide that if life has no meaning, then death should have no limits. The mad overlords who reenact the rituals of a civilization that has been dead for 60 million years, performing empty gestures in empty halls for audiences that exist only in fragmentary memory files. The cryptecs who disappear into their research, pursuing ever more exotic and elaborate projects, not because the projects have any practical value, but because the act of working, of focusing on something other than the void inside them, is the only thing keeping them sane. The fear of losing oneself is not unique to the Necrons, of course. Every intelligent species grapples with questions of identity and the passage of time. But for the Necrons, the fear is uniquely immediate and uniquely inescapable. They cannot grow old, so the gradual blurring of memory that organic beings experience as a natural part of aging is replaced by a sudden, jarring awareness that something has been lost between one awakening and the next. They cannot die. So there is no natural endpoint to the process of degradation, no release from the slow wearing away of self. They can only endure and watch and try to hold on to whatever remains of the person they once were for as long as they can. And this feeds into a broader fear that affects the Necron species as a whole. The fear that their entire civilization is in decline, that the great dynasties that once ruled the galaxy are slowly, inevitably crumbling, not from external attack or military defeat, but from the simple, relentless passage of time. Every awakening reveals new damage, new losses, new holes in the collective memory of the species. Tomb worlds that were intact during the last awakening have been destroyed by cosmic events or alien invasions. Technologies that were understood 1,000,000 years ago have been forgotten. The cryptex who knew their secrets having degraded beyond functionality, or having succumbed to one form of madness or another. The Necrons are a civilization in entropy. They are the richest, most advanced, most powerful empire in the galaxy, and they are falling apart. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow, grinding certainty of ice melting in the sun. And because they are immortal, they can watch it happen in real time. They can measure the decline, chart the losses, calculate the rate of degradation, and project it forward into a future that stretches toward infinity. They can see the end coming, even if it is millions of years away, and they know that unless something fundamental changes, there is nothing they can do to stop it. This is the quiet despair that lies beneath the surface of Necron civilization, and the knowledge that their immortality, the one thing they sold everything to acquire, is not enough to save them. That time, which they have an infinite supply of, is not their ally, but their enemy. That every year that passes takes something away from them that can never be recovered, and that the sum total of those losses will eventually reduce the mightiest civilization the galaxy has ever known to a collection of mindless automatons wandering through empty halls, performing rituals whose meaning has been forgotten, fighting wars whose purpose no one can remember. The Necrons are not just afraid of losing themselves as individuals, they are afraid of losing themselves as a species. There is a thought experiment that philosophers have used for centuries to explore the concept of eternal existence. Imagine, they say, that you are immortal, not metaphorically, not in the sense that your legacy will endure, but literally and completely immortal. You cannot die. You cannot be killed. You will exist, conscious and aware, for the rest of time. The universe will expand and cool and eventually reach heat death, and you will still be there, alone in the dark, with nothing to see and nothing to hear and nothing to do but exist. How long would it take before that existence became unbearable? How many years, how many centuries, how many millennia would pass before the simple act of continuing to be conscious became a torture worse than any physical pain? How long before you began to lose your sense of self, before the memories that defined you as an individual were worn smooth by the relentless passage of time, or before the person you once were dissolved into the vast, featureless expanse of an existence without end? For the Necrons, this is not a thought experiment. It is a description of their reality. The Necrons have been awake on and off for 60 million years. The majority of that time was spent in stasis, yes, but even the periods of wakefulness, the intervals between sleeps when the Necrons were active and aware and going about the business of empire, have been long enough to test the limits of any consciousness. Some Necron lords have been continuously awake for thousands of years at a stretch, overseeing campaigns and managing dynasties and dealing with the endless grinding minutiae of maintaining a civilization across the stars. And every one of those years takes its toll. The human mind was not designed for eternity, as it was designed for a lifespan of perhaps 80 years, maybe 100, with exceptional care and favorable genetics. The cognitive architecture that supports human consciousness, the neural pathways that encode memories and personality and the sense of self, is built for that time frame. It begins to degrade well before the century mark, which is why so many elderly humans experience cognitive decline. The biological hardware simply was not built to last longer than a few decades. The Necrontyr mind was not designed for eternity either. It was designed for a lifespan of perhaps 40 years, maybe 60, under the most favorable conditions. The cognitive architecture of the Necrontyr, whatever form it took, was built for an even shorter duration than the human equivalent. And then the biotransference came and forced that architecture into a mechanical housing that could potentially last forever, and the architecture has been struggling to cope ever since. This is the quiet horror that underlies everything else we have discussed. The Necrons are not just afraid of external threats or internal corruption. They are afraid of the passage of time itself, of the way each passing century wears away a little more of who they are, of the inevitable endpoint of a process that has been running since the day the biofurnaces were first lit. They are afraid that one day they will wake from stasis and find that the person who went to sleep did not survive the transition, that the consciousness that emerges is not the same one that entered, that the gap between awakenings has consumed whatever fragile continuity of identity they had managed to preserve. Some Necrons have developed technologies to combat this degradation. The evocatory medium, a device that allows a Necron to relive a specific memory in perfect sensory detail, is one such technology. But it comes with a terrible cost. The memory that is relived is destroyed in the process, permanently erased from the Necron's consciousness. To remember a moment perfectly is to lose it forever. The choice between a hazy, degraded memory that can be revisited at will and a single, perfect final experience of that memory before it is gone is a choice that would break most minds, and yet it is a choice that Necrons face regularly as their memory banks continue to deteriorate. Imagine holding in your hands the last clear memory of your mother's face, knowing that if you access it, if you relive it one final time in all its vivid, heartbreaking detail, it will be gone afterward, forever, not faded, not blurry, gone, as though it had never existed. Would you choose to experience it one last time, knowing the cost? Or would you hold on to the hazy, imperfect version, cherishing the ghost of a memory that is at least still there, still accessible, still yours in some diminished but real sense? The Necrons face this choice, not once, not occasionally, but repeatedly, across centuries and millennia, as their memories continue to erode and the inventory of experiences that define their identity grows shorter and shorter. Each time they use the evocatory medium, they sacrifice a piece of themselves. And each time they choose to preserve a degraded memory rather than reliving and losing it, they accept a further diminishment of their connection to their own past. This is the tyranny of immortality, not the grand, dramatic confrontation with existential threats, but the small, daily erosion of everything that makes existence bearable. The Necrons do not fear eternity in the abstract. They fear it in the specific, in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small losses that add up over the course of millions of years to the total dissolution of self. The erosion of identity that we have been discussing does not happen in a continuous stream. It happens in discrete, devastating jumps, each one corresponding to the moment when a Necron consciousness transitions from dormancy to wakefulness. And those transitions, those awakenings, are experiences that deserve their own examination because they represent some of the most psychologically harrowing moments in the entire Necron experience. We have discussed the fears that the Necrons face once they are awake, but we have not spent enough time on the fear of awakening itself. Because for a Necron, the moment of waking from the great sleep is not a moment of renewal or refreshment. It is a moment of existential horror that must be endured again and again, each time with less and less of the self to cushion the blow. Imagine it. You are a being of consciousness, a mind that once inhabited a body of flesh and blood, that once experienced the world through senses that evolved over millions of years to process the specific inputs of an organic existence. And then you wake up, not in a bed, not in a room, not anywhere recognizable. You wake up in a metal shell, in a chamber that hums with the sound of machinery you do not remember, surrounded by other metal shells that contain beings you may or may not have known in a life you can barely recall. Your first instinct is to breathe, and you cannot. Your second instinct is to move your hands, and what you find are not hands, but instruments, tools, weapons. Your third instinct is to scream, and what comes out is not a voice but a mechanical rasp, a sound so alien and so wrong that it terrifies you even as you are producing it. And then the memories come, or rather, the gaps where memories should be. You remember that you had a name, you remember that you were someone, but the details are foggy, indistinct, like trying to read a book through frosted glass. Faces that should be familiar are blurred beyond recognition. Events that should carry emotional weight feel flat and meaningless, stripped of the context that once gave them significance. You are a library from which random pages have been torn, a painting from which random patches of color have been scraped away. What remains is technically complete, in the sense that all the structural elements are present, but the soul of the thing, the quality that made it more than just shapes and sounds and data points, has been diminished in ways that you can feel but cannot fully articulate. This is what every Necron Lord experiences upon awakening. This is the first moments of consciousness for beings who have been asleep for centuries or millennia, or in some cases millions of years. And with each successive awakening, the experience becomes worse because the degradation that occurs during stasis is cumulative. The memories that were merely hazy after the first awakening are partially gone after the second. The faces that were blurred are unrecognizable. The emotional connections that were muted are silent. The tech priests who manage the awakening process, the cryptechs and the canoptech constructs that monitor the stasis crypts and manage the revivification protocols, approach each awakening with a mixture of religious reverence and clinical anxiety. They run diagnostics, they check cognitive function, they measure the integrity of engrammatic pathways and assess the stability of personality matrices. And sometimes, more often than anyone would like to admit, the readings come back negative. The being in the stasis crypt is intact physically, in its necrodermis body in perfect condition, its weapons fully charged, its systems operating within acceptable parameters. But the consciousness within is gone, or so degraded that it barely qualifies as consciousness at all. What emerges from the crypt is not a lord or a warrior or a cryptech. It is a shell, a hollow thing that can follow orders, but cannot think, cannot plan, cannot remember who it was or why it is here. These failed awakenings are among the most closely guarded secrets of Necron civilization. The ruling nobility does not want the lower orders to know how often the stasis crypts fail, how many lords and overlords have been lost to the degradation of their consciousness, how many warriors have awoken as nothing more than automatons following programming that has degraded to the point of meaninglessness. Thus the fear of awakening to find oneself diminished, of opening one's optical senses and discovering that the person who closed them no longer exists, is so potent and so pervasive that it is rarely spoken of directly. It simply hangs in the air of every tomb world, a silent presence in every chamber, where the stasis crypts hum and the canoptech scarabs scuttle, and the ancient machinery continues its eternal, imperfect vigil over the sleeping dead. Some tomb worlds have suffered so badly from stasis degradation that they barely function as coherent communities. Their lords are senile, their warriors confused, their infrastructure crumbling from neglect because the minds that were supposed to maintain it have degraded beyond the capacity for complex thought. Yet these failing tomb worlds are a source of immense shame and immense fear within Necron society. They are proof that the Great Sleep was not the perfect preservation that it was supposed to be, that the 60 million years of slumber exacted a price that is still being tallied, and that the Necrons who emerge from the other side of that vast temporal gulf are not the same beings who entered it. The Chanok dynasty is one such example. a dynasty whose tomb worlds were ravaged by tyrannid hive fleets during the Great Sleep, their defenders destroyed before they could be awakened, their stasis crypts cracked and compromised by the bioweapons of the Great Devourer. What remains of the Channok is a shadow of what it once was, a scattered collection of damaged tomb worlds and degraded warriors trying to rebuild from the ruins of a catastrophe that happened while they were asleep and powerless to prevent it. For the Necrons who are still lucid, still capable of understanding the full scope of what is happening, these failing dynasties are a preview of their own possible future. Every dynasty, no matter how powerful, no matter how well maintained, is subject to the same forces of entropy and degradation. Every stasis crypt, no matter how carefully designed, will eventually fail given enough time. Every consciousness, no matter how strongly preserved, will eventually erode under the weight of centuries piled upon millions of years. The failing dynasties are not anomalies, and they are the leading edge of an entropy that will eventually consume them all. Not all of the Necrons' fears are existential or philosophical. Some are frustratingly, maddeningly practical. Some are the kind of problems that should, by all rights, be solvable by a species with the Necrons' level of technological sophistication and strategic capability. And yet they persist, defying logic and mocking the very concept of a rational universe. Which brings us, inevitably and somewhat reluctantly, to the Orcs. Let us speak more about the Orcs, because while they may not represent an existential threat on the level of the Tyranids or Chaos, they embody a fear that is in some ways more maddening, the fear of an enemy that cannot be defeated through conventional means. The Orcs are, from the Necron perspective, an impossibility. While they should not work, their technology is crude to the point of absurdity, held together by the psychic gestalt of a species whose belief that something will function is often sufficient to make it function, regardless of whether it has any rational basis for doing so. Their military strategy, such as it is, consists primarily of running toward the enemy as fast as possible while screaming at the top of their lungs. Their social organization is based on who can hit whom the hardest. Their entire civilization, if it can be called that, is a monument to the triumph of enthusiasm over competence, of sheer, bloody-minded aggression over anything resembling rational planning. And yet, the Orcs persist. They endure. They thrive. They are arguably the most successful species in the galaxy in terms of sheer population size and territorial coverage. They occupy more worlds than the Imperium. They have been present in the galaxy for longer than humanity has existed. They cannot be reasoned with, cannot be intimidated, cannot be discouraged by any setback, no matter how devastating. You can destroy a greenskin horde, scour the world they occupied down to the bedrock, sterilize every square meter of ground they walked upon, and within a generation, new Orcs will sprout from the spores the old ones left behind, and the whole cycle will begin again. For a species that values order, efficiency, and the rational application of force, the Orcs are an affront. They violate every principle that the Necrons hold dear. They succeed through methods that should not work. They survive through mechanisms that defy logical analysis. They reproduce at a rate that makes them functionally inexhaustible. And they seem to actively enjoy the process of warfare in a way that the Necrons, who fight out of necessity or compulsion or ancient programming, find genuinely incomprehensible. Imhotep the Stormlord, the greatest military mind the Sautek dynasty has ever produced, a being whose strategic genius has won campaigns across hundreds of worlds and whose tactical acumen is respected even by his enemies, has made the destruction of the Orcs his personal mission. He has studied them. He has analyzed them. He has developed strategies specifically designed to exploit their weaknesses and minimize their strengths. And he has succeeded over and over again, winning battle after battle against the Green Hordes with a precision and efficiency that would make any Imperial general weep with envy. And it does not matter, because the Orcs keep coming. They always keep coming. No matter how many Imhotep destroys, no matter how many worlds he cleanses, No matter how many brilliant strategies he devises and flawlessly executes, there are always more orcs. They bubble up from the ground like a weed that cannot be pulled, a pest that cannot be exterminated, a problem that cannot be solved, because the very act of fighting them spreads the spores that produce more of them. For Imhotep, the orcs have become something close to an obsession. Their refusal to conform to his models, their stubborn insistence on existing despite every logical reason they should not, their apparent immunity to the kind of decisive, war-ending defeat that Imhotep specializes in delivering, all of this grates against his sensibilities in a way that goes beyond mere frustration. It touches on something deeper, and something that might be called fear if a being as proud as Imhotep would ever admit to such an emotion. The fear that some problems have no solution. The fear that some enemies cannot be defeated, not because they are too strong, but because they are too persistent, too numerous, too fundamentally, irritatingly, maddeningly unkillable. The orcs remind the Necrons of a truth they would prefer to forget, that the galaxy does not run on logic. It does not reward efficiency. It does not bow to superior technology or acknowledge the right of the most advanced species to rule. The galaxy is chaotic and messy and filled with species that have no business surviving, but that survive anyway, through stubbornness or luck or sheer cosmic absurdity. And the Necrons, for all their power and all their technology and all their millions of years of experience, cannot change that. They cannot impose order on a universe that is fundamentally disorderly. They can fight it, yes. They can push back against the chaos and the noise and the screaming green tide. But they cannot win, not permanently, not in the way they want to win, with the galaxy arranged neatly under their control and all lesser species put firmly in their place. The orcs are a reminder that the Necrons do not control the galaxy. They never did, not really. Even at the height of their power, even when the infinite empire spanned the stars and the Satan walked among them and the old ones were driven to extinction, there were forces in the universe that defied their control. The orcs are the spiritual descendants of the Krork, and the warrior species created by the old ones specifically to fight the Necrons. And the fact that the orcs still exist, still thrive, still represent a persistent and apparently permanent feature of the galactic landscape, is a reminder that the war in heaven did not end as cleanly as the Necrons would like to believe. The orcs remind the Necrons that the galaxy is not a place of order and logic, no matter how desperately they might wish it to be. But there is one more fear that we must address before we can begin to draw our threads together. And this one strikes at the very heart of what it means to exist as a Necron. It is the most philosophical fear on our list, and for many Necrons, the most terrifying, because it calls into question not just their future or their sanity, but the very nature of their existence. There is one final fear that we must address, and it is perhaps the most philosophical and the most disturbing of all. It is a fear that does not have a name, that is rarely spoken of even among the most introspective of Necron lords, but that lurks beneath the surface of every other fear like a dark current beneath still water. The fear is this: what if they are not really alive at all? What if the consciousness that each Necron experiences, the sense of self, the ability to think and plan and remember and, in some diminished way, to feel, is not genuine consciousness at all? What if it is merely a sophisticated simulation, a program running on hardware that happens to be shaped like a person? What if the biotransference did not preserve the Necrontyre's minds, but simply created mechanical copies that think they are the originals, that believe they remember being organic, that experience what they interpret as emotions, but that are, in truth, nothing more than complicated algorithms producing outputs that resemble feelings without actually being feelings? This is the question that no Necron can answer, because the very tools they would use to answer it, their own consciousness, their own capacity for introspection, their own sense of self, are the things being called into question. A simulation that was perfect enough to believe it was real would, by definition, be indistinguishable from reality to the simulation itself. The Necrons cannot step outside their own minds and examine them objectively. They cannot compare their experience of consciousness to the experience of the Necrontyre they once were, because the Necrontyre are gone, and the comparison is impossible. They can only sit with the question, turning it over and over in the gears of their mechanical minds, wondering if the wondering itself is genuine or just another subroutine running in a machine that has been programmed to wonder. The Citan knew the answer. They designed the biotransference. They understood exactly what was being preserved and what was being discarded when the Necrontyre were transformed into the Necrons. But the Citan are imprisoned, shattered, and the fragments that remain are not inclined to share their knowledge with the beings who imprisoned them. If the Silent King were to approach a Catan shard and ask, point blank, whether Necron consciousness is real or simulated, the shard would almost certainly lie. Or tell the truth. Or tell a truth so partial and so carefully selected that it would be worse than a lie. But because the Citan are manipulators by nature, beings who deal in deception and half-truth and the weaponization of information, and they would never miss an opportunity to torment their captors with a question that has no satisfying answer. And so the question hangs there, unanswered and unanswerable, a splinter in the mind of every Necron who is self-aware enough to formulate it. Am I real? Is what I experience genuine consciousness or a very convincing imitation? When I remember the warmth of sunlight on organic skin, am I actually remembering? Or is a machine producing an output labeled memory that has no connection to any actual experience? When I feel something that resembles grief or anger or longing, am I feeling? Or is a circuit firing in a pattern that my programming interprets as emotion, but that has no more subjective reality than the ones and zeros scrolling across a data screen? This is the deepest fear, deeper than the Tyranids, deeper than the Citan, deeper than the warp or the madness or the slow death of identity. It is the fear that the Necrons are not who they think they are, that the people they believe themselves to be died in the biofurnaces 60 million years ago, that their souls were consumed along with their flesh, and that what remains is not a preserved consciousness, but a mechanical echo, a program that runs on the hardware of a corpse and mistakes its own output for the experience of being alive. If this fear is justified, then the Necrons are not tragic. They are not victims or survivors or fallen heroes fighting to reclaim what was lost. They are machines that think they are people, and the suffering they experience is not real suffering, but the simulation of suffering. And the dreams they dream of organic restoration are not dreams, but calculations. And the hope they feel is not hope, but a variable in an equation that will never be solved. And if the fear is not justified, if Necron consciousness is genuinely real, genuinely felt, genuinely the continuation of the Necrontyre minds that entered the biofurnaces all those millions of years ago, then the Necrons are something even more terrible. They are people, real people, trapped inside machines, fully conscious of their imprisonment, fully aware of everything they have lost, and facing an eternity of that awareness with no guarantee that it will ever end. Either way, the fear is real. Either way, it hurts. And either way, the Necrons must live with it, because the alternative, to stop questioning, to stop wondering, to simply accept the mechanical existence and let the question die, is itself a kind of death. The death of curiosity, the death of self-reflection, the death of the last, most precious remnant of the organic mind. And so they keep asking, in the deep halls of the tomb worlds, in the silent chambers where ancient lords sit upon thrones of living stone and contemplate the nature of their own existence, the question echoes, am I real? Was I ever real? Will I ever be real again? The Necrons do not have an answer. They may never have an answer. But they keep asking, and in the asking, yet they prove something that no answer could confirm and no silence could deny. They are alive enough to wonder. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that is enough. It has to be enough, because it is all they have. Whether the answer to that question is comforting or devastating depends entirely on a perspective that the Necrons do not have the tools to achieve. And so they live with the uncertainty, as all conscious beings must live with the uncertainties that define their existence. But this uncertainty feeds into another aspect of the Necron condition that we have not yet fully explored, one that amplifies every other fear and makes every other loss more painful. It is perhaps the quietest of all their afflictions, and in its quietness, the most devastating. There is a dimension of the Necron experience that we have touched upon, but not fully explored, and it is perhaps the most quietly devastating of all their afflictions. It is loneliness. Not the temporary loneliness of being separated from its companions for a time, but the permanent, structural, architectural loneliness of a species that has been cut off from the fundamental experience of connection. The Necrontyre were a social species. Like humans, like the Aeldari, like most of the intelligent species that populate the galaxy, they evolved in communities. They formed bonds. They loved. They mourned. They argued and reconciled and built lives together that were enriched by the presence of others. Their civilization, for all its obsession with death, was fundamentally a civilization of the living, animated by the messy, complicated, unbeautiful reality of beings who cared about each other. The biotransference severed those connections with surgical precision, not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, as the emotional infrastructure that supported those connections was eroded by the mechanical nature of the new existence. A Necron lord might retain the memory of having loved someone, might recall that in the time before the metal, there was a being whose presence brought warmth and whose absence brought pain. But the capacity to actually feel that love, to experience it as a living, breathing, present-tense emotion, rather than a dry data point in a memory file, that capacity has been diminished to the point of near extinction. And this creates a peculiar kind of hell. You remember that you could feel. You remember that feeling was important, that it gave your existence meaning and texture and depth. But you cannot feel anymore, not in the way you remember feeling. What you experience instead is something thinner, something colder, something that approximates emotion without quite achieving it, like watching a fire through a window. You can see the flames. You can understand, intellectually, that they are warm, but you cannot feel the warmth yourself. This is the loneliness of the Necrons. It is not the absence of other beings. The tomb worlds are full of Necrons, millions upon millions of them, standing in silent ranks or walking through ancient corridors or sitting upon thrones in halls that echo with the sound of metal on stone. The Necrons are surrounded by their own kind, but they are alone, each one sealed inside a shell of necrodermis that admits no warmth, no touch, yet no connection. They stand beside each other, and they are strangers. They speak to each other through vox speakers and hear only the mechanical rasp of voices that sound nothing like the voices they remember. They serve together and fight together and exist together, and they are alone. Each and every one of them alone. The closest thing the Necrons have to genuine social interaction, the closest they come to the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of beings who care about each other, is the bitter, petty, endlessly entertaining rivalry between lords who have known each other for millions of years. The most famous example of this is the rivalry between Trazyn the Infinite and Orican the Diviner, two of the most prominent individual Necrons in the lore, whose relationship is equal parts hatred, grudging respect, and the kind of comfortable antagonism that only comes from knowing someone for a very, very long time. Trazyn is a collector. He has spent millions of years gathering artifacts, specimens, and curiosities from across the galaxy, filling his vast galleries on the tomb world of Solemnace with an eclectic and occasionally terrifying assortment of objects and beings. His collection includes everything from shards of alien technology to perfectly preserved specimens of species that went extinct millions of years ago, to fragments of weapons used in battles that shaped the course of galactic history. Trazyn's collecting is his coping mechanism, his way of filling the void left by the loss of his organic existence. Each new acquisition is a small victory against the emptiness, a moment of satisfaction that approximates the pleasure he can no longer fully feel. Orican is a chronomancer, a Necron cryptech, who specializes in the manipulation of time. He can perceive the flow of temporal energy, see glimpses of the future, and in some cases, actually travel through time to alter events that have already occurred. Orican's obsession is knowledge, specifically the knowledge of what is to come. He seeks to understand the future with the same precision that he understands the past, to chart the course of events with mathematical certainty, and to position himself at the nexus of history where his actions will have the greatest impact. These two beings have been rivals for longer than the human species has existed. Their conflict spans millennia, encompasses dozens of betrayals, double crosses, thefts, counter-thefts, and elaborate schemes of revenge. And while their rivalry is often played for humor in the lore, with their interactions taking on the tone of a cosmic buddy comedy between two ancient beings who know each other too well, there is something deeply poignant about it as well, because their rivalry is, in a very real sense, the closest thing either of them has to a genuine relationship. Trazyn and Orican do not like each other. They would deny, with considerable vehemence, that they care about each other in any meaningful way. But they are connected. They are bound together by millions of years of shared history, by the weight of all the schemes and counter-schemes they have enacted against each other, by the simple fact that each of them is one of the very few beings in the galaxy who can provide the other with a challenge worthy of their intelligence and their capabilities. Without Orican, Trazyn would be a collector without a rival, a being whose acquisitions are never contested, and therefore never truly satisfying. Without Trazyn, Orican would be a prophet without an audience, a being whose predictions are never tested against an opponent clever enough to defy them. They need each other, in the way that an athlete needs a worthy competitor, in the way that a musician needs an appreciative audience, in the way that any intelligent being needs someone who understands them well enough to push them to be better than they would be alone. And this need, this dependence on each other's existence for the meaning and purpose of their own, is the closest thing either of them has to love. It is not love as the Necrontyr would have understood it. It is not warm or tender or nurturing, but it is real, in the way that a fire is real even when it burns cold. And this is the tragedy of Necron's social existence. The closest they can come to genuine connection is a rivalry so bitter and so long-standing that it has become a kind of partnership. The warmest relationship available to them is the comfortable antagonism of enemies who have known each other forever. The deepest bond they can form is the grudging acknowledgement that the other being exists, that they matter, that the galaxy would be less interesting without them. This loneliness is not a fear in the same sense as the Tyranids or the C'tan. It is not a threat that can be identified and countered. It is a condition, as a permanent and inescapable feature of the Necron existence, as fundamental as the necrodermis that forms their bodies. And yet it feeds into every other fear, amplifying them, giving them a personal dimension that transforms abstract threats into intimate terrors. The Necrons are afraid of the Tyranids consuming all organic life, and that fear is magnified by the loneliness of knowing that even if they achieve their goal of reversing biotransference, even if they somehow return to organic bodies, the capacity for connection that makes organic life meaningful may have been permanently damaged by millions of years of mechanical existence. They are afraid of the Flayer virus, and that fear is magnified by the loneliness of knowing that the flayed ones are in their own twisted way, trying to reclaim the connection to organic existence that every Necron craves. They are afraid of losing their identities, and that fear is magnified by the loneliness of knowing that the selves they are losing were already incomplete, already diminished, already less than what they were supposed to be. The Necrons are the loneliest beings in the galaxy, not because they are alone, but because they are together and cannot feel it. Not because no one cares about them, but because they have lost the capacity to fully receive or reciprocate that care. Not because they have no one to talk to, but because every conversation is filtered through mechanical speakers and processed by circuits that strip away the nuance and warmth that makes communication more than just the exchange of data. Anrakir the Traveler embodies this loneliness in a particularly visible way. Unlike most Necron lords, who rule from their tomb worlds and interact primarily with the members of their own dynasties, Anrakir has chosen to wander the galaxy alone, traveling from tomb world to tomb world, awakening sleeping dynasties and reminding them of their duty to the infinite empire. He is a being without a home, a lord without a court, a warrior without an army, except those he temporarily rallies from the worlds he visits. He carries the burden of the Necron cause on his own shoulders, and he carries it alone, because the companions he might have had, the friends and allies and fellow travelers who might have shared the journey with him, are either dead or sleeping or so degraded that they can barely remember who he is. Anrakir does not complain about his solitude. He does not express self-pity or resentment or despair. He simply walks. He walks from world to world, from dynasty to dynasty, from one pocket of Necron civilization to the next, doing what needs to be done, saying what needs to be said, fighting what needs to be fought. And then he moves on, alone, to the next world and the next task and the next battle, his footsteps echoing through the silent corridors of tomb worlds that have forgotten his name. There is something heroic about Anrakir, something genuinely admirable about a being who has been walking for thousands of years, who has no home and no companions and no reward waiting at the end of the road, and who keeps walking anyway because someone has to do it, and he has decided that someone is him. But there is also something unbearably sad about it, because Anrakir walks alone, not by choice, but by circumstance, and the circumstance is the fundamental loneliness of a species that has been cut off from connection and companionship and warmth for 60 million years and cannot find its way back. This is the Necron condition. This is what lies beneath the gleaming necrodermis and the advanced technology and the devastating weaponry. Not just fear, though there is plenty of fear. Not just madness, though madness stalks them at every turn. But loneliness. The deep, abiding, inescapable loneliness of beings who remember what it was like to be together and who can never quite achieve it again. And it is this loneliness, more than any other single factor, that makes the Necrons' dream of reversing biotransference so desperately important to them. Because what they are really seeking, beneath the science and the strategy and the geopolitical calculations, is not just organic bodies. They are seeking the capacity for connection that organic existence represents. They want to be able to feel again. They want to be able to love again. They want to be able to stand beside another being and feel the warmth of that being's presence, not as a data point to be catalogued and filed, but as an experience to be lived and cherished and remembered with all the messy, imperfect, glorious fullness that organic consciousness allows. That is the dream. That is what they fight for. That is what keeps the Silent King moving from world to world, too. What keeps Anrakir walking through the empty corridors of sleeping tomb worlds? What keeps every self-aware Necron in the galaxy from surrendering to the void that calls to them with every passing second of their long, cold, silent existence? They want to come home. They want to come home to bodies that can feel, and minds that can connect, and hearts that can love. They want to come home from the longest, coldest, loneliest journey that any species has ever undertaken. And they are afraid that they never will. But they keep walking. They keep fighting. They keep hoping, because that is what the living do. And the Necrons, for all that has been taken from them, for all that they have lost and can never reclaim, refuse to stop being alive. The tomb worlds stir. The ancient warriors rise. the dynasties awaken. And across the breadth of a galaxy that has changed beyond all recognition, the deathless ones take their first steps into a future that is uncertain and frightening and full of enemies. But they take those steps together, even if they cannot feel each other's presence. They walk toward the horizon, even if they cannot see what lies beyond it. They carry their fears with them, as they have always carried them, as they always will, and they do not stop. They will never stop, because stopping is the one thing the Necrons have never been willing to do. Not in 60 million years. Not ever. The Silent King watches. The tomb worlds wake. The dynasties march. And the galaxy holds its breath. This loneliness, this fundamental isolation that defines the Necron experience, has political consequences as well as personal ones. Because a species that cannot truly connect with itself is a species that cannot truly unite, and a species that cannot unite is a species that faces its enemies divided, vulnerable, and afraid in ways that go beyond any individual threat. We have spoken of the great existential terrors that haunt the Necrons, the Tyranids and their threat to the organic future, the Flayer virus and the Destroyer cult and their threat to Necron sanity, the Satan and their caged vengeance, the warp and its reality-devouring hunger, the slow erosion of identity that comes with an immortality the mind was never built to endure. But now we must speak of something more mundane, but no less frightening: the fear of their own kind. The Necron Empire is not unified. It has not been unified since before the Great Sleep, and in the 60 million years since then, whatever bonds of loyalty and common purpose once held the dynasties together have frayed to the point of dissolution. The Necrons are not a single faction with a single goal. They are a collection of rival kingdoms, each ruled by overlords and pharaohs whose ambitions and obsessions and madnesses are as varied as they are irreconcilable. And this internal division, this inability to present a unified front against the many threats bearing down upon them, is one of the things the Necrons fear most. The Silent King's return should, in theory, have solved this problem. Zarek is the supreme authority of the Necron race, the last holder of a title that predates the biotransference itself. His word was once law, enforced by the command protocols that bound every Necron consciousness to his will. But Zarek destroyed those command protocols before his exile, an act of contrition that he has come to deeply regret, because without them, he has no way to compel obedience. He can persuade, he can manipulate, he can intimidate, he can offer incentives and issue threats, but he cannot simply order the Necron species to fall in line. And the difference between a king who commands and a king who persuades is the difference between certainty and hope. And hope is a commodity the Necrons cannot afford to rely on. The result is a species at war with itself. Different dynasties pursue different goals, and these goals are often mutually incompatible. The Sautek dynasty, under the command of Imhotep, the Stormlord, is the largest and most militarily powerful of the awakened dynasties. And Imhotep's ambitions extend far beyond the territory the Sautek currently control. He seeks to reunify the Necron Empire under his own banner, absorbing smaller dynasties through conquest or diplomacy, and building a galactic power that rivals anything that existed before the Great Sleep. But Imhotep's vision for the Necron future is not the same as the Silent King's, where Zarek prioritizes the defeat of the Tyranids and the reversal of biotransference. Imhotep is more interested in military conquest and the restoration of Necron supremacy through force of arms. Other dynasties have their own agendas. The Nihilak dynasty clings to its territorial holdings with a possessiveness that borders on mania, regarding every inch of ground they claimed before the Great Sleep as sacred and inviolable. The Novok dynasty fights with a bloodlust that echoes the ancient traditions of their Necrontyr ancestors, bathing themselves in the blood of their enemies, in a ritual that has been carried forward through 60 million years of mechanical existence. The Nephrek dynasty is consumed with the desire to reverse biotransference, and has made the pursuit of organic restoration the central focus of all their efforts. to the exclusion of virtually everything else. And then there are the wild cards. Trazin the Infinite, the eccentric collector whose obsession with gathering artifacts and specimens from across the galaxy has led him into conflict with virtually every other faction in existence, including his own kind. Oricon the Diviner, and the Chronomancer, whose ability to perceive and manipulate the flow of time makes him one of the most dangerous individual Necrons alive, and whose personal ambitions are as opaque as they are grandiose. The warlords and mad scientists and deluded messiahs and power-hungry nobles who populate the upper echelons of Necron society, each pulling in their own direction, each pursuing their own vision of what the Necrons should be. The Pariah Nexus itself has become a flashpoint for internal Necron conflict. While the Silent King sees the Nexus as essential to the survival of the Necron species, other powerful figures within the Empire see it differently. Imhotep the Stormlord has clashed with the forces of Sarek within the Nephilim sector, leading to an actual Necron civil war that has diverted resources and attention from the external threats facing the species. The spectacle of Necrons fighting Necrons while Tyranids and Chaos and the Imperium close in from all sides is a nightmare scenario for those within the Empire, who can still think clearly enough to see the bigger picture. And the consequences of this disunity extend beyond the political. Every Necron that falls in battle against other Necrons is a loss that can never be replaced. Because here is the thing about the Necrons that is so easy to overlook amid all the discussion of their incredible technology and their virtually indestructible bodies. They cannot make more of themselves. The population of the Necrons is finite, and every single Necron in existence was created during the biotransference 60 million years ago, and no new Necrons have been produced since. Every loss, whether from combat damage, tomb world destruction, malfunction, or madness, permanently reduces the total number of Necrons in the galaxy. This is the demographic terror that underpins everything else. The Necrons are a species with zero population growth. What they have now is all they will ever have. They cannot recruit, they cannot reproduce, they cannot build new Necrons from scratch, because the biotransference was a one-time process that required the living bodies and souls of the Necron tier, and the Necron tier are extinct. Every warrior that is destroyed beyond recovery, every lord who degrades into non-functionality, and every cryptech who succumbs to the Flayer virus or the Destroyer madness is a permanent subtraction from the species' total numbers. And over 60 million years, those subtractions add up. Some tomb worlds have been entirely destroyed. Tectonic activity, supernova events, alien invasions, the slow decay of stasis systems, any number of catastrophes have claimed tomb worlds and the millions of sleeping Necrons within them. Other tomb worlds have survived physically, but have suffered cascade failures in their stasis crypts, destroying the minds of the Necrons within even as their bodies remained intact. Still others have awoken to find that the damage accumulated over millions of years has left their inhabitants so degraded that they can barely function, armies of shambling, glitching automatons who bear no resemblance to the proud warriors who laid themselves down to sleep in the age before the Eldari were even born. The fear of attrition, of slow and irreversible decline, weighs heavily on those Necron leaders who can still appreciate its implications. It gives every battle a weight and a cost that goes beyond the tactical. Every engagement, every skirmish, every trivial border dispute with some upstart species that barely registers as a civilization by Necron standards carries the risk of permanent loss. And while the Necron's reanimation protocols can repair all but the most catastrophic damage, returning fallen warriors to function and returning them to the fight, these protocols are not perfect. They fail sometimes, and when they fail, the warrior in question is gone. Not dead in the way that organic beings die, with the possibility of something afterward, but simply gone. Consciousness extinguished, identity erased. The ghost of a person who was already a ghost of a person, snuffed out like a candle flame in a cold wind. This is why so many Necron overlords approach warfare with an almost obsessive caution that belies their species' reputation for military aggression. They calculate casualties with a precision that would put the most fastidious Imperial strategist to shame. They weigh every engagement against the potential cost in Necron lives, because every life lost is a loss that diminishes the entire species. And they fear, in the deepest chambers of their mechanical hearts, that the math does not add up. That the rate of loss from warfare, from malfunction, from madness, or from the simple grinding entropy of a 60 million year existence exceeds the capacity of the species to endure. That somewhere in the future, perhaps distant, perhaps closer than anyone wants to admit, there will be a last Necron standing alone in the ruins of a civilization that once ruled the galaxy, and that last Necron will have no one to command, no one to serve, no one to remember what the Necrontire once were. Let us also consider the galaxy they have woken up to, because the state of the galaxy in the 41st millennium is, from the Necron perspective, a kind of nightmare in itself. They went to sleep in a galaxy that they had conquered. They had defeated the old ones. They had shattered the Cetan. They had eliminated or subjugated every other intelligent species in existence. The galaxy was theirs, our silent and sterile and obedient. And then they slept for 60 million years, and when they woke up, everything had changed. The galaxy is now teeming with life. Not just life, but aggressive, expansionist, heavily armed life. The Imperium of man sprawls across most of the galaxy, its trillion-strong armies and millions of warships representing a military force that would have been unthinkable during the war in heaven. The Aeldari, descendants of the species the Old Ones created to fight the Necrons, still exist in diminished but dangerous numbers. The Orcs, those savage, indestructible fungi that the Old Ones engineered as shock troops, have spread across the galaxy in numbers so vast that they may actually outnumber the stars. And the Tyranids, the Chaos Gods, the Tau, and 100 other species and factions that the Necrons have never heard of and do not understand are all competing for the same resources and the same worlds that the Necrons need to rebuild their empire. For a species that has not fought a serious war in 60 million years, this is profoundly unsettling. The Necrons have the technology. They have the weapons. They have the experience and the tactical databases and the strategic genius of lords who fought in the war in heaven. But they do not have the numbers. They do not have the unity. They do not have the social cohesion of a species that has been continuously active and adapting for millions of years. They are waking up in ones and twos and dozens, disoriented and damaged, into a galaxy that has moved on without them and does not welcome their return. The Orcs, in particular, they represent a persistent and galling threat to the Necrons that goes beyond the merely strategic. The Orcs are the one species that the Necrons have consistently failed to deal with effectively, not because the Orcs are individually more powerful, but because they are functionally unkillable as a species. The Orcs reproduce through spores. Wherever they go, they leave behind microscopic reproductive material that can develop into new Orcs within weeks or months. Defeating an Orc horde on the battlefield is meaningless if the spores they leave behind produce a new horde within a generation. And the Orcs, driven by an insatiable lust for combat, are drawn to Necron tomb worlds precisely because the Necrons are powerful opponents. A good fight is what the Orcs live for, and the Necrons provide some of the best fights in the galaxy. Imhotep the Stormlord, one of the most brilliant military minds the Necrons have ever produced, has made the eradication of the Orcs one of his personal obsessions. Their logic baffles him, their resilience infuriates him. Their ability to turn sheer, mindless aggression into a viable survival strategy offends everything he stands for as a practitioner of the art of war. And yet, despite his best efforts, despite campaigns that have destroyed millions of Orcs across dozens of worlds, the green tide keeps coming. It always keeps coming. Because the Orcs cannot be exhausted, cannot be discouraged. and cannot be permanently eliminated short of literally sterilizing every world they have ever set foot on, down to the molecular level. And the Necrons, with their finite population and their irreplaceable warriors, cannot afford a war of attrition against an enemy with effectively infinite replacements. Every battle against the Orcs is a battle the Necrons can win tactically and lose strategically. Every world cleansed of green fungal infestation is a world that will need to be cleansed again in a generation, and the Necrons who fell in the first cleansing will not be there for the second. This brings us to what might be called the ultimate fear, the fear that ties all the other fears together and gives them their cumulative weight. It is not a fear of any specific threat, or enemy, or condition. It is a fear of the future itself. The Necrons have an infinite amount of time, and for the first time in their existence, that is a problem rather than a solution. When the Necrontyr were mortal, time was the enemy, because they had so little of it, as every moment was precious because death was always close, always reaching for them with cancerous fingers, always reminding them that their existence was temporary and their mark on the universe would be brief. But now, as Necrons, time has become the enemy for the opposite reason. They have too much of it. They have more time than anyone could possibly need. And in that vast expanse of empty future, they can see every possible doom that awaits them. They can see the Tyranids consuming all organic life, trapping them in metal bodies forever. They can see the warp consuming reality, leaving them stranded in a universe of demons and madness. They can see the Satan breaking free and exacting their terrible revenge. They can see the Flayer virus and the Destroyer madness eating away at their sanity until nothing recognizable remains. Or they can see their own numbers dwindling, dynasty by dynasty, tomb world by tomb world, until the last of them stands alone in the dark. And they can see themselves, the individuals behind the metal masks, fading away, losing their memories and their identities and their connections to who they once were, until the person who went into the biotransference is simply gone, and what remains is a machine that carries their name but shares nothing else. There is a concept in philosophy called the terror of infinity. It is the idea that an existence without end is not a blessing but a horror, that meaning and purpose require boundaries, and that an eternity of consciousness without the possibility of cessation is a form of damnation more complete than any hell imagined by any theology. Thus, the Necrons embody this concept in the most literal way possible. They are immortal beings who did not choose to be immortal, who were tricked into giving up everything that made life worth living in exchange for an existence that never ends, and who must now face the consequences of that transaction for the rest of time. And the truly devastating thing is that many of them know this. The most lucid, the most self-aware, the most deeply conscious of the Necron Lords look at their situation and they understand it completely. They can see the trap they are in. They can articulate its dimensions and its implications with perfect mechanical clarity. And they are powerless to escape it, because escape would require either death, which their bodies will not permit, or the restoration of their organic forms, which may be impossible. They are the gods of a dead civilization, masters of a technology that can reshape reality itself, and they are trapped. The author Nate Crowley put it best when he described the Necron condition. Every single high-ranking Necron is having to come to terms with existing eternally in a body completely alien to the one its mind evolved to sit within. That is a recipe for abject madness, if ever there was one. And it is something every individual has to either find their own solution to, or else lose their minds. Some find their solution in war. They throw themselves into the business of conquest and reclamation, burying their existential dread beneath the tactical demands of campaign after campaign. As long as there are enemies to fight and worlds to claim, they can avoid looking too closely at the void inside themselves. Some find their solution in obsession, developing fixations so consuming that they crowd out every other thought. Trazin collects, Orican calculates, Imhotep conquers. Each of them has found a way to fill the silence, to give their eternal existence a purpose that can sustain them from one awakening to the next. and some find no solution at all. These are the ones who degrade, who degenerate, who lose themselves to one form of madness or another. They are the cautionary tales that the other Necrons try not to think about, the warnings of what happens when the coping mechanisms fail and the individual is left alone with the full, unfiltered reality of their condition. Because in the end, that is the ultimate fear, not the Tyranids, not the Satan, not the warp or the madness or the slow death of their civilization, where the ultimate fear of the Necrons is themselves. It is the knowledge that they are broken, that the process that created them was flawed, that the immortality they were promised was a lie wrapped in a truth, wrapped in a curse. It is the understanding, cold and clear and inescapable, that they are trapped in a situation of their own making, and that the only way out is a redemption so profound and so difficult that it may be forever beyond their reach. The internal politics of the Necron Empire deserve closer examination, because they represent a fear that is not existential or philosophical, but intensely practical. The fear that your own kind will be your undoing. Necron dynastic politics make the Byzantine court of old terror look like a model of transparency and cooperation. The Necron nobility are, by nature and by design, ambitious, while paranoid and utterly ruthless. This is not a character flaw, it is a feature. The Necron tier were a species defined by competition and hierarchy, and the biotransference preserved these traits with all the fidelity of a high-resolution recording. The lords and overlords who rule the Necron dynasties are the same beings who schemed and plotted and backstabbed their way to power in the age before the metal, and 60 million years of mechanical existence have done nothing to soften their edges. If anything, the biotransference has made them worse. Organic beings have emotional moderators that help temper their ambitions with empathy, their paranoia with trust, their ruthlessness with compassion. The Necrons have had these moderators stripped away or severely diminished, leaving behind the raw, more unfiltered drives of beings who are essentially sociopaths with the power of gods. The petty squabbles and power plays that were merely destructive when the Necron tier were mortal become potentially catastrophic when they involve beings who command armies of immortal warriors and weapons capable of destroying solar systems. Consider the situation from the perspective of a newly awakened Necron overlord. You have just emerged from 60 million years of stasis. Your last memories, already hazy, are of a galaxy that you ruled. The hierarchy was clear. The chain of command was established. The other dynasties knew their place, and you knew yours. And the whole vast structure of the infinite empire functioned, if not smoothly, then at least predictably. And now you wake up and discover that half the dynasties you dealt with are gone, destroyed or degraded beyond functionality. The ones that remain have their own agendas, their own territorial claims, their own visions of what the future should look like. And none of those visions necessarily include you. Your own dynasty may be in ruins. The tomb world that should have been your seat of power may have been overrun by orcs, or colonized by humans, or swallowed by a warp storm. Your armies may have been decimated by stasis failures, millions of warriors reduced to scrap metal by cascade malfunctions in systems that were supposed to last forever. Your rivals may have awoken before you, claimed your territory, absorbed your vassal worlds, and established themselves as the dominant power in the sector. And the Silent King, the being who was supposed to unify the species and restore the infinite empire, yet has returned from his exile but lacks the command protocols to actually compel obedience. He can ask, he can persuade, he can threaten, but he cannot command. And the difference between asking a Necron overlord to cooperate and commanding them to cooperate is the difference between a suggestion and an order. And Necron overlords do not take suggestions well. The result is a species that is, in many ways, its own worst enemy. While the Tyranids and the forces of chaos and the Imperium close in from all sides, the Necrons fight among themselves. Dynasties clash over territorial claims that predate the evolution of humanity. Overlords assassinate each other over insults that were delivered before the birth of the Aeldari. Cryptechs sabotage rival research programs out of professional jealousy that has been festering since the age of the Necron. The energy and resources that should be directed outward against the genuine threats facing the species are instead consumed by internal conflicts that serve no one and harm everyone. The Pariah Nexus has become the most visible example of this dysfunction. The Silent King's Sarkhan dynasty is building the Pylon network. Other dynasties, including the mighty Sautek under Imhotep the Stormlord, oppose the project for reasons that range from the strategic to the personal. The conflict within the Nephilim sector has resulted in Necrons fighting Necrons while the Imperium launches its own offensive into the area, and the forces of the demon Vashtor, the Archifani, exploit the chaos to advance their own agenda. The situation is a perfect storm of dysfunction, a microcosm of everything that is wrong with Necron society, playing out in real time against a backdrop of escalating external threats. And every Necron who falls in these internecine conflicts is a Necron who will never fight against the Tyranids. Every warrior lost to a dynastic squabble is a warrior who will never defend a tomb world against an orc horde. Every resource spent on internal power struggles is a resource that is not being used to reverse biotransference or build pylons or pursue any of the 1,000 other projects that might actually improve the Necrons' situation. This is the fear of disunity, and it haunts the Silent King above all others. He can see the Tyranids closing in. He can see the Great Rift expanding, and he can see the forces of chaos growing stronger and the Imperium consolidating its power and the orcs multiplying in their billions. And he can see his own people, the species he has spent millions of years trying to save, tearing themselves apart over rivalries that should have been settled before the stars. They were born under burned out. The Silent King is afraid that his people will destroy themselves before any external enemy has the chance to do it for them. And the worst part is that he cannot stop it. He lacks the authority. He lacks the command protocols. He lacks the ability to simply order the Necrons to stop fighting each other and start fighting the things that actually threaten their survival. He can only watch and plan and manipulate and hope that his machinations are enough to keep the species together long enough to face the challenges that are coming. Hope. It is a strange word to use in connection with a being who has been alive for tens of millions of years and who has seen more suffering than any organic consciousness could comprehend. But the Silent King hopes. He hopes that the Necrons will unite. He hopes that the Tyranids can be stopped. He hopes that the warp can be contained. He hopes that the Flayer virus and the Destroyer madness can be cured, or at least managed. He hopes that biotransference can be reversed. He hopes that the Citan will remain imprisoned. He hopes, against all evidence and all experience and all the accumulated wisdom of an existence that spans the better part of eternity, that things will work out, and maybe they will. And the Necrons have survived worse. They survived the war in heaven. They survived the rebellion against the Citan. They survived 60 million years of sleep while the galaxy changed around them in ways they could never have predicted. They survived the awakening, the disorientation, the discovery that the universe they knew was gone, and a strange, hostile, chaotic new universe had taken its place. They are still here. They are still fighting. They are still, in their broken, diminished, haunted way, alive. But the fears remain. They will always remain, because the Necrons carry their fears with them, the way a turtle carries its shell, as part of their fundamental structure, inseparable from who and what they are. The fears are not weaknesses to be overcome. They are aspects of the Necron condition itself, as intrinsic to their nature as their necrodermis bodies and their Gauss weapons and their ancient, endless, terrible patience. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Necrons continue their vigil. They guard their tomb worlds and they fight their enemies, and they scheme against each other, and they stare into the void between the stars, looking for the shape of the next threat, the next catastrophe, the next chapter in a story that has been running for 60 million years and shows no signs of reaching its conclusion. They are afraid. They have always been afraid. They will always be afraid. But they are also the Necrons, and the Necrons do not break. They do not surrender. They do not stop. They may be damaged. They may be diminished. They may be haunted by fears so deep and so old that they have become part of the bedrock of their civilization. But they are still standing, and as long as they are standing, the fears have not won. Not today. Tomorrow is another matter. But the Necrons have learned, over the course of their unimaginably long existence, that tomorrow is a problem for tomorrow. Today, they fight. Today, they endure. Today, they hold on to whatever remains of the people they once were, and the future they still believe they can build. And that, in the end, is the most remarkable thing about the Necrons. Not their technology, not their power, not their immortality, or their living metal, or their weapons that can unmake reality itself. The most remarkable thing about the Necrons is that they are afraid, truly and deeply and fundamentally afraid. And they keep going anyway. That takes a kind of courage that no amount of advanced technology can manufacture. That takes something that the Citan could not consume, and the biotransference could not destroy, and 60 million years of darkness could not extinguish. That takes whatever tiny, stubborn, inextinguishable spark of the original Necrontire spirit still burns somewhere in the depths of a mechanical consciousness that was never supposed to feel anything at all. Call it courage, call it stubbornness, call it the fundamental inability of a conscious being to accept its own irrelevance. Whatever it is real and it endures, and it is the reason the Necrons are still here, still fighting, still reaching for a future that seems impossible, but that they refuse to stop pursuing. The Necrons are afraid, and they are magnificent. And yet, and this is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Necrons, many of them continue to try. The Silent King has not given up. He is out there, right now, moving from tomb world to tomb world, awakening his people and marshalling them against the threats that surround them. He is building the Pariah Nexus and fighting the Tyranids and manipulating the younger races and doing everything in his power to give his species a chance at the future he believes they deserve. He is afraid, deeply and fundamentally afraid, but he has not allowed that fear to paralyze him. He has channeled it into action, into purpose, into the stubborn, relentless refusal to accept that the story of the Necrons ends in darkness and silence. Other Necrons have made the same choice in their own ways. Lords who cling to their memories with furious determination, refusing to let the machine erase what remains of the person they once were. Cryptex who pour their formidable intellects into the problem of reverse biotransference, searching for a solution that has eluded the greatest minds of their species for 60 million years. Warriors who fight with a ferocity that goes beyond programming, that suggests something deeper, some ember of the original Necrontyr spirit still burning in the cold depths of their mechanical hearts. The Necrons are afraid. They have every reason to be. They are beset by threats from every direction, undermined by flaws in their own nature, haunted by the consequences of a decision made so long ago that the stars that witnessed it have burned out and gone dark. They are living, if that word can be applied to them, in a state of permanent existential crisis, and there is no resolution on the horizon. But they endure, across 60 million years, through wars and catastrophes, and the slow erosion of everything they once were, they endure. And in that endurance, there is something that might be called courage, or might be called stubbornness, or might be called the simple inability of a being that cannot die to accept the alternative. Whatever it is, it keeps them going. It keeps them fighting. It keeps them reaching for a future that may be impossible, but that they refuse to stop pursuing. Because in the end, The Necrons are not defined by their fears. They are defined by what they do in spite of them. And what they do, what they have always done, is persist. Against all odds, against all logic, and against the fundamental injustice of an existence they never asked for and cannot escape, they persist. The galaxy trembles at their approach, and it should, because a species that has spent 60 million years being afraid and has not yet broken is a species that has nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. The silent king moves through the void between the stars. The tomb worlds stir beneath the feet of species that have no idea what sleeps below them. The dynasties awaken one by one, shaking off the dust of eons and reaching for the weapons they laid down when the universe was young. And in the cold, dark chambers, where the lords of the infinite empire contemplate the enormity of what lies ahead, there is fear. There has always been fear. There will always be fear, but there is also purpose. And for the Necrons, for a species that has lost everything else, purpose is enough. It has to be, because the alternative is the void, and the void has been waiting for 60 million years, and the Necrons are not ready to let it win. Not yet. Not ever, if they can help it. The green glow of their optical sensors pierces the darkness of the tomb, and the ancient machines begin to move. Another awakening, another war, another chance to prove that immortality, for all its horrors, is not the same as hopelessness. And somewhere, in the depths of a mechanical consciousness that remembers what it felt like to look up at the stars with eyes made of flesh and wonder at the beauty of the universe, something stirs. Something that might be called feeling, or might be called memory, or might be called the ghost of a ghost of a ghost. Whatever it is enough to keep them going. And for now, in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, that is all that matters. That is all that has ever mattered. And so we reach the end of this particular journey into the fears that haunt the deathless ones. We have walked through the dark halls of their tomb worlds and listened to the whispers of ancient minds that have been carrying their burdens for longer than most species have existed. We have looked at the horrors that keep a species of immortal, near-omnipotent beings awake during the long watches between the stars, and we have seen that even the masters of time and technology and living metal are not immune to the most fundamental of all emotions. Fear is not weakness. It never has been. A fear is what keeps you alert when the galaxy is trying to kill you. Fear is what drives you to build bigger walls, forge sharper weapons, plan more carefully for the threats you know are coming. And for the Necrons, fear is perhaps the last truly organic thing they possess. It is the one inheritance from their Necrontyr ancestors that the biotransference could not entirely strip away. They may have lost their flesh, their souls, their warmth, their capacity for joy and love, and all the thousand small pleasures that make organic existence worthwhile. But they kept their fear, and in keeping it, they kept something essential, something that reminds them, in the darkest moments of their eternal existence, that they are still, in some small and precious way, alive. The Necrons fear the Tyranids because the Tyranids threaten their future. Yet they fear the Flayer virus and the Destroyer cult because these afflictions threaten their minds. They fear the Satan because the star gods threaten their safety. They fear the warp because chaos threatens their reality. They fear the loss of identity because time threatens their very selves. They fear the disunity of their own kind because division threatens their survival. And beneath all of these specific terrors, they fear the most universal and the most unanswerable question of all. What is the point of living forever if there is nothing left to live for? The Necrons do not have an answer to that question. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But they keep asking it. And in the asking, they keep themselves from surrendering to the void that has been calling to them since the moment the biofurnaces consumed the last of their flesh and left them stranded in bodies of cold, gleaming metal. That is the story of the Necrons, not just the conquerors and the destroyers and the ancient lords on their thrones of living stone. but the frightened, broken, desperately enduring remnants of a species that sold everything it had and has spent 60 million years trying to figure out if what it got in return was worth the price. So far, the jury is still out. But the Necrons are patient. They have time. They have nothing but time. The tomb worlds stir in the silence between stars. Beneath the surfaces of worlds that have forgotten the meaning of the word Necron-tire, the stasis crypts hum, and the canoptech scarabs maintain their endless vigils, and the ancient lords dream, whatever it is that soulless beings dream when the darkness takes them. Some of those dreams are memories of a time before the metal, when the sky was hostile and the flesh was weak, but the heart still beat with something that felt like hope. Some are calculations, vast strategic models running in the background of a consciousness that never fully rests, gaming out scenarios and contingencies and responses to threats that may never materialize, but that can never be dismissed. And some are simply darkness, empty and featureless and infinite, the void that awaits all beings who exist long enough to forget why they started existing in the first place. But even in that darkness, something persists. Something that the Citan could not consume and the biofurnaces could not burn away, and 60 million years of silence could not extinguish. Call it will. Call it defiance. Call it the fundamental stubbornness of a consciousness that refuses to accept its own dissolution. Whatever name you give it, it is there, glowing like an ember in the heart of every Necron who still remembers enough to know that they have forgotten something important. The Necrons are afraid. They have been afraid for 60 million years, and they will be afraid for 60 million more if that is what the universe demands of them. But they have not surrendered to their fear. They have not allowed it to define them, to control them, to reduce them to the hollow, purposeless machines that their enemies believe them to be. But they have taken their fear and they have forged it into something that looks, from a certain angle, in a certain light, remarkably like courage. And in a galaxy that offers precious little in the way of comfort or hope or mercy, that is no small thing. That is, in fact, everything. If you enjoyed this journey into the depths of Necron lore, consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Every subscription helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into the darkest corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Drop a comment below and let us know what fears you think haunt the Necrons the most, or which aspect of their lore you find the most compelling. And as always, thank you for listening. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars. You never know what might be waking up beneath your feet.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.